Programming certification. I used to be a certified personal trainer, and really what I do is I take large chunks of information and I try to boil it down into easy to retain chunk sizes of information and presentation that's somewhat fun, somewhat interactive, but hopefully you mostly walk away with the knowledge and the curriculum and at least have some understanding of what the topic was about. So that's why I get added to the team.
Before we get started, we are going to go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves. If you'll just say your name, what kind of clinician you are, if you're a therapist, what license you have. At the master's level in Oklahoma, you can have 1 of 5 licenses to be a therapist. So we have some of all 5 on staff. We have case managers here who need their ethics for their renewal for their case management certification. We have at least 1 graduate student counselor in training joining us virtually today as well. So we will start with you, Derek, and we'll just go around the room real quick.
Okay, Derek Woodbury. I'm a licensed professional counselor, supervision, and with improvement life for I guess about 7.5 years.
Carolyn Ingram, LPC, licensed professional counselor, and I've been here about 6 or 7 years as well.
Yvonne Lewis, certified brain spotting therapist, LPC, been here about 5 or 6 years.
And Yvonne was one of the very first certified brain spotting therapists in the state. So
It's a very cool modality.
Love it.
Yeah, it's cool.
So we're starting to get some more. So that's good.
Yeah, it was very interesting. You were the first person that I heard about having that, and so I did a ton of research on it, and I was just like, man, that's really cool. So I've recommended your for several people.
Thank you.
Deborah Tommy, LPC.
Trisha Crace, LPC. Amanda Hardy, LPC.
Carol Short, LPC.
Christina Wilson, LPC.
Marion Motley, LPC.
Sandra Armstrong, case manager 2, and I've been here since 2016 or 2017.
So it seems like of all the therapists, we have all LPCs today. Which is probably because LPCs, continuing education, we have to have turned into the state by the end of June. And ethics is required for everyone, and we got this approved through the board to do the ethics for that. So.
And unfortunately, I'll be in Italy in June, so we couldn't do it in June. Yeah.
No last minute.
You could fly us all into Italy.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we talked about it, but Kneale just wasn't willing to spring for his application.
So those of you that are virtual, if you can one at a time, unmute yourself and introduce yourself as well, and hopefully we can hear you. Hopefully you can hear us. We'll try to speak loudly so that you can hear us as best you can. I know it's going to be difficult for you to see the screen behind us, the presentation, but.
We will send out the PowerPoint to anyone who wants it, though.
Who's going first?
I'll go.
Okay.
I'm Tracy Staten, CM2. I used to be a BHRS back whenever Improving Lives first started. And I am the CM2, not Tracy Staten, not the admin Tracy Staten. So there's two of us now, which is super confusing. So there
right.
you go.
Hi, Tracy.
Who's next? We've got.
I'm Piper Shaw, and I am the LPC.
Okay.
I'm Marla Murray, graduate student counselor in training.
Welcome.
I'm Amelia Henderson. I'm the case manager too with the agency.
Okay. Welcome.
I'm Deborah Colston, MS LPC in Western Oklahoma.
Welcome. It's because of your email why we offered it virtually, so She's from Elk City, and she was like, is there any way for those of us on the other side of the state would be able to attend? So we're like, okay. We have Linda. Okay. Okay. And we have Linda and Regina. Can each of you unmute it if you know how to do that and introduce yourself real quick?
I'm Linda Rogers, LPC.
Welcome. We have too many people and I can't see everyone all at once, so I know Regina's on there. She's a case manager, I believe a case manager 2 with us, and then I did see Kelly, who's also from Elk City. I saw that she logged off. I don't know if she's having problems or not. She may be back, but I may just not be able to see her. As far as I know, I think that's everyone that's on virtual right
Okay.
now too. So
Welcome, thanks for joining us.
I'm going to get my camera video started, and then we will get started with the presentation.
I did want to say thank you so much
Your
for
head's
doing
kinda
this
getting cut off.
virtually. I
Is it?
really
Yeah. Awesome.
You are very welcome.
Thank you. Awesome, thank you so much.
There, and video. and record. All right, it is recording.
Great.
So, we've done the introductions. All right, I'll let you start.
Yeah, so this is something I learned whenever I was doing my certification in neurolinguistic programming, which is kind of a sister modality to hypnosis. And so one thing that I always like to do is set a positive emotional and mental state before I take on any learning task, before I try to accomplish anything new. And typically what I like to do is I like to get everyone to try to remember a time whenever you were proud of yourself or you accomplished something. And what I'd like for you to do is either close your eyes or find some way to kind of get back there in your mind and remember the sights, remember the colors, remember what it sounded like, if it was something that somebody said to you, said they were proud of you, if you remember having your name called as you walked across the stage, if you came first in a race, whatever it is that makes you feel positive, whatever it is that you can go back and remember that, and then see if there's any kinesthetic feelings, any tactile feelings that you have in your body, and see if you can increase those and make those grow. Because what happens is, we begin to release all those same chemicals from our brain that we had during that experience, and it recreates that positive emotional state, helps our limbic system retain more information. It's all really good practice. So if everyone just want to take a minute to kind of do that and connect with that, if you're the type of person that likes to say a silent prayer or whatever to set a mental state, that's fine. But however you do that, I'd like to encourage you to take a moment now and just increase that, try to turn that intensity up, and then feel that, and just allow that to kind of permeate throughout your whole being. And then once you've done that, I'd just like you to come back to this present moment, be ready for us to engage, and just move forward. All right. How's everyone feel? Good? All right, thank you for participating with that. I know it may sound silly, but it does help a lot of people. I know it helps me. So, all right.
It's
So let's
an
go ahead.
excellent thing to do in your therapy session.
Yeah, yeah.
I have to do it anytime I've ever worked with a client with hypnosis. I have to do it every time before and after a client myself, for my own self. So, and you also don't want to take on people's baggage. So you have to kind of reset, or I do anyway. So one thing I like to talk about is the 4 stages of competence or the learning process. Some of you may be familiar with this. Some of you, this might be the first time ever hearing about this 4-step model. But basically it begins with you can't know what you don't know. So that's unconscious incompetence. We can't know what we don't know. So if I'm unconscious of a thing, I'm obviously incompetent at it, or don't have the competency to speak on it eloquently. So that's your first stage in learning anything. So remember, if some of this stuff is new, like we have words like beneficence and things like that, if that's the first time you're really hearing it, don't get too wrapped up in retaining how to spell it and the definition. Just kind of remember that this is beginning of the learning process. So this is the first time hearing about it. You're not going to be 100% accurate and good at it first time out of the box. So that's the first thing to remember. But then
Let me just give an example of that real
Sure.
quick. So if you've never driven a car,
sure.
you don't know what you need to know to drive a car. Now, most of us, by the time we drive a car, we've been in a car, we've observed some, we know some. But if you are an alien from another planet and you come here and you see cars and you don't have cars on your planet or whatever, and you don't, like, you see they move around, but you have no idea how to do what, so.
Yeah, when I went to seminary, one of my buddies was from the UK, and he had moved here, and he had never even dreamed of owning a car. It was like, we don't have cars where I live. There's no need for them. It was kind of like the way it was set up was kind of like New York City, so a lot of public transport, and he was like, people my age just don't have a car. So the first time he was ever in a car, it was a catastrophe, and I was just like, man, how'd you get around without a car? But so yeah, I remember being 10 and 2 and gripping that wheel and looking through in my mirrors and making sure, I was doing everything correctly. And then now I'm looking over, seeing, somebody putting on eyeliner, drinking a cup of coffee, driving a stick shift. It's like, that's when you've gotten to a place of, I'm not encouraging it, but you've gotten to a place of unconscious competence. You're not even really having to think about it. You've mastered it, right? And I know we all think we've mastered driving more than we probably have, but we all have kind of mastered it at this point. We feel pretty comfortable behind the wheel. I could hand you my keys and you could drive that car, no problem. Everybody in this room could. I wouldn't let you, but.
Right, so when you first start learning to drive a car, it's moving into the second stage, you're beginning to realize what you don't know. And if you first start learning to drive a car, and you're only learning to drive one, you're learning the things specific to that car. You learn where the windshield wipers are in that car. But if you've only been in one car, and then you move to a different car, and the windshield wipers turn on differently, it's a knob instead of a switch or something,
Yep.
Then you realize, oh, there's more that I don't know
Right.
yet.
Right, and that is the place of conscious incompetence, that you're now aware of the things that you don't know a lot about, right? And then you've got your conscious competence. Most people, that's really where we stop growing in areas. Most people get to a place of like, I know what I'm doing, right? So it's good enough, and we kind of stop growing. So one thing that we kind of want to do, especially with ethics, is focus on trying to maintain that mastery level, unconscious competence, to where it's just part of our being, just part of an innate structure, a foundation that we have. So, but that's why it's good to do this in groups, because all of us have different experiences and have had to handle different moral and ethical situations in unique ways, and so the collective group coming together and sharing those experiences is what helps us have a better bedrock and foundation in ethics.
So our analogy of the car situation, the unconscious competence, an example of that would be, you get in your car, maybe you're leaving the office, you go home, and then you get home and you realize, you know what, I'm not even aware of me driving the streets to the house. I just realized I'm here at the house now. You're thinking of something else or whatever, and your mind is just on autopilot, and you're competent to drive a car, but just unconsciously, your brain just did it and took you home.
Almost like a flow state, So, and really, whenever you think about it, our negative and positive emotional states, happiness, sadness, those things, those are unconscious competence. We don't have to think about how to be happy. We just are happy when we're happy, right? So even our emotional states are a form of mastery. And we know how to be happy. We know how to be sad. Nobody has to tell us. Now, sometimes we may have to make ourselves be happy, if we're sad, but we don't have to be reminded to be happy when we are happy, right? So does that make sense? Awesome.
And that's what we're doing in therapy. If someone's feeling an emotion that they don't want to feel, we're taking it from the unconscious competence of them feeling that emotion, and we're bringing it back here. We may be bringing back here, like, they might not even know why they're feeling that, or
Anybody trained in CBT, you're probably familiar with that process. I mean, that's the whole process of going back and relearning those emotional states.
Right, we're coming back and we're, okay, well, what's the thought behind the emotion you're feeling? Or how can we reframe this? Are we gonna change this thought?
Right. Yeah.
All right.
So knocking out the legal stuff. This is all fun stuff. What's HIPAA? Anybody?
It's right there.
It's a governing body that allows us to do what we do the way we do it.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So it's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It's a U.S. law designed to provide privacy standards to protect patients' medical records and other health information provided to health plans, doctors, hospitals, and other health care providers. Does anybody have an example of a HIPAA violation? Something that's a no-no. What's that?
Confidentiality.
Confidentiality. What's an example of something that we can't do?
Posting on Facebook. My client said this today.
There you go. Very good. Very good. Yeah, we can't do that, right? Yeah, that's a big no-no. We all
How about TikTok?
TikTok, yeah. TikTok's brought in a whole lot of fun things.
Do not record your clients.
Yeah.
Post on social media.
Right? Yeah,
You
no.
shouldn't even be recording at all,
Mm-hmm.
with very few exceptions. And there are specific, you have to get the informed consent of your client. It will be signed. It's all legal. A lot of times the graduate students have to do that to take back to their classes, for their classes to
Yeah.
review and give feedback on the
And
work that they are doing with the client.
with COVID, telehealth has created, a lot of unique ethical questions about HIPAA and things like that. So I know that now if you are gonna do that, if you're going to be digitally keeping records and things like that, I believe the software has to be encrypted and things like that now too. So there's a lot of, you can't just, get it consent and record and then think you're okay. Because once that goes up to the cloud, you could be in violation of a HIPAA violation right there.
So I'm going to point out one thing before we leave this slide, and then I'm going to ask one question. So first of all, it's HIPAA, it's H-I-P-A-A. The common mistake is a lot of people spell it,
Hippo.
not HIPAA, but like that. They put H-I-P-P.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
It's two A's,
Yeah,
two
not
P's.
two P's.
Guilty.
So,
I've done it. I didn't have to type it fast. I've done it before.
so the question I want to present to you is, because of COVID and rule changes and stuff, the federal government relaxed HIPAA
Mhm.
standards and stuff. So if the federal government allows something, but your state licensing board doesn't allow it, are you able to do it?
Follow your
No.
state. Follow my agency.
Well, yes,
I'm
where you
teasing.
work, you should follow agents.
Follow
So
the board.
particular places where you
Yes.
work may have their own standards that cannot violate state law or federal law. But they may have more strict standards than what the law allows. But yes, you have to follow the standards of the licensing board in your state. So, when they were doing this, I had seen in a mental health professional group that I belong to on Facebook, and there was a group that was doing something that at one point wasn't allowed. And so I messaged them. I didn't call them out publicly, but I private messaged them, and I said, how are you doing this? And they said, well, the federal government has relaxed this rule, this standard, whatever. They are allowing it. And like I said, at the master's level, you can have one of 5 licenses in the state of Oklahoma to be a therapist. And this clinician was not an LPC, so different licensing board. So I don't know the other licensing board rules as well as I know the LPC, because I myself am an LPC, so those are the ethical rules I have to follow. But I knew that the LPC board did not allow it. And so I told this provider, as an LPC, our board doesn't allow it. You may want to check with your LCSW board, because if they don't allow it, you shouldn't be doing it either. And I don't think they really cared. I think they're just like, well, the federal government allows it, so we're gonna do it. And I'm like, if you get caught and your board doesn't allow it, you can make that argument with the board. But I would not go against what our board says just because the federal government allows it, I don't think the board would accept that as an
Excuse
argument.
me,
Yes,
Neil,
uh-huh,
I'm sorry to break up the meeting, but for the sake of us that's on, Google's Meet,
Uh-huh.
could y'all put that microphone a little bit closer to yourself? So
I
we
can do
hear
that,
better?
yes.
That would really help a lot.
Okay, let me unplug this.
My next question is, do you have, a handout for this program that we'll get later on?
Yes,
For this ethics class? Okay.
yes, we will email it to you.
Okay, but I was really concerned about the clarity of the,
Let's
presentation.
try that. Hopefully you can see the screen a little better now, and hopefully you'll be able to hear us a little better now too. You're welcome, thank you for pointing that out.
And Neil, that brings up another good point that you were making. Oh,
Yes?
You know, I thought I was the only one at the beginning when you guys said something, Hardy didn't understand what you were saying down. It was very, Hardy, you know, so funny, and thank you, Amelia, for saying that, because I thought I was the only one. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for letting us know. Did you want to continue with your?
That's it, that's all I have for
Okay.
this one.
But that brings up a good point. Most often today, whenever we talk about, like, if something's questionable, don't. Like, you know, I mean, that's gonna be a lot of what the consensus normally is like, if it's iffy, don't.
Just don't do it.
But,
Well, and that reminds me, I mean, that's what comes up a lot when clinicians want to staff a case with me or something, and they wonder, you know, if it's something that's reportable, you know, does DHS need to be called? First of all, if you are aware of a situation where DHS needs to be called, they need to be called within 24 hours. So don't wait a week to staff it, you know, don't wait for supervision. That's when you send a text, and I'll, you know, get back with you as soon as possible. But if you're in doubt, you know, make the report, because they'll let you know if, you know, they can't do anything with it. But it's better to be safe and to protect your client and to protect yourself than it is not to make the call and then have a situation where that falls back on you. Now, when I first moved back to Oklahoma after I graduated with my master's in counseling, which was in 2003, at the time, in Oklahoma, a clinician had never been prosecuted for not making a hotline report that should have been made. That changed since then. There was a situation where there was a therapist in Tulsa where DHS did get called out to a home, and the therapist had been in the home earlier in the week and hadn't called DHS and was prosecuted and found guilty originally. Then it was appealed and that decision was overturned. So I don't know, besides that case, if there is, but you don't want your license in jeopardy either, so.
that was a unique situation, like, the incident wasn't happening while the therapist was there or something.
But that was the argument, that the situation could have changed between the time the therapist was there and when DHS actually had been out there. It was several days later in the week. That was the argument that the defense attorney made. And then I believe they also countersued the prosecutor for, I don't remember the technical term, it's like aggressive prosecution, like,
Yeah.
you know.
Prosecutorial misconduct or something like that, you know, but overreaching, basically. So that, given that, I don't think that it's as likely anymore that they really come after clinicians as hard that way, because the countersuit, you know, kind of puts some safety in there. Nobody wants to get countersued. So, but anyway.
But I think that cost that person hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, so you don't want to be in that situation either, so. You know, a lot of times when clinicians do consult with me for a case, you know, a lot of times they know and they just want to hear it from someone else and just to have that reaffirmed to them that they're on the right path and stuff. But I mean, there are some times, and I can't think of a specific case, but there are cases that clinicians have staffed with me where, you know, where I say, this isn't something reportable, you know, so, and then they don't. Just one last reminder, since everyone here works with us, if you do make a DHS report, you know, document it in your progress notes, and then we also have the form on our website, and that makes it really easy because in the clinician section of our website, that way if we ever have to look up, we can just search by that form and they're all together. And that makes it a lot easier instead of having to find a client and go through all their progress notes and see if it was documented, if it was done. So.
Anybody want to add anything to that? No? Awesome. Well, getting back to HIPAA, we can't really talk about HIPAA without talking about informed consent. So we're going to go ahead and cover that and the legalities around that really quickly. Did you want to handle this one? This is kind of your area.
Sure. So we touched upon this when I was talking about, you know, graduate student counselor in trainings needing to get informed consent in order to record a session. And so informed consent, we are explaining this to our clients when they do their initial intake paperwork. We are explaining the process to them, and they have to agree to receive services without duress. We're not forcing them, to, you know, they're not being blackmailed. So recently, at the federal level, a law was passed because people were complaining that they were getting bills and that they weren't understanding what the costs were up front. I don't know all the technicalities of that. I don't know if it necessarily applies at the therapist level. I know it applies to psychologists. We're conservative. Lots of times we do things to protect ourselves. I have examples of things we've done in the past before it became a requirement, and in the future it changed and it became a requirement, and we were already doing it. So those of you that are fully licensed, seeing clients with private insurance, that's why the private insurance is, what their benefits are, is verified before they start, and it's emailed to the person, and the person emails back stating that they've received that. So that's protecting ourselves, that they know what the costs are up front, so that, you know, if they have a deductible and they get, you know, get a statement later, you know, they can't say, I didn't understand, I didn't know what the costs were gonna be and stuff. What we're trying to do now is trying to get the costs up front. So that's why it will say in there, you know, this person has this amount of a deductible, so the first so many sessions you charge this amount, and then after that, if they have a copay or co-insurance, you know, if it's 20% co-insurance, then they pay this amount from then on. Or if it's just a flat fee for a copay, $35. You know, we have our new admin, Tracy, is here Tuesday through Fridays until 8 p.m. And we have someone here start at 9 o'clock in the morning. So if you're doing sessions during that time, you can have them take the payment for your client. If you're doing sessions outside of hours, you can have the client pay ahead of time. You can either have them pay the day before and then check with the admin and verify that they did. A lot of clients will just take a picture on their phone and send it to the clinician to show that they paid through the website just by clicking the make a payment button and stuff. By doing it that way, that reduces having to send statements to clients, and that makes sure that you get paid.
One thing I always like to ask questions about with everyone are like exceptions to confidentiality. What are some examples to exceptions to confidentiality?
Making a DHS report.
Absolutely.
That's absolutely correct. Yep.
So when I do intakes for clients, I go over 5 exceptions. So let's go around. And so Yvonne told one, and that's the first one that I tell people, is that we are mandated reporters, just like teachers. If we find out about abuse or neglect, there are 3 classes that are protected by that in Oklahoma. What are the three classes? Do you know who that applies to?
Adults and children.
Children,
Seniors.
Older adults.
What's the last one?
Self.
LGBTQ plus.
Really mentally, emotionally challenged.
Or just vulnerable.
Adults who have a legal guardian. Yep. So that's the third one. So that's the first one I go over. I also let people know that if you're an adult and you told me that, you know, let's say you're a young adult, 18, 19, and you told me that you were abused as a child, I'm still gonna report that. It's not gonna affect you directly now because you're an adult, you're out of the situation, hopefully out of the situation. But DHS will take that as information in case that adult's around other kids. If they get a report on that adult in the future, that makes their case stronger because they've already have the information from you as well. So it helps prevent other kids from being abused in the future. I also tell my clients, if you tell me about someone else that's being abused, even if that person is not my client, I'm still gonna report it. I'm gonna get as much information as I can and give it to DHS to report it. You know, we're trying to keep people safe and protect people even if they aren't our direct client. So, that's the first exception. What other exceptions are there?
Duty to warn. Duty to warn.
Duty to warn. So, for me, in the list, in the order I go, that's the third one I talk about. So,
You have a pretty good example of that, don't you? Of somebody who, duty to warn, didn't report it, and something about, like, a guy was threatening to bite somebody's thumb off or something?
Well, that's where it became, that's
a
the
court
case, and I
case.
think it was in California.
Yeah.
That's where it became a law.
Yeah. That fascinated me, first time I heard that. It was the first time we were doing this, I was like, what?
So, it originally became, you know, if someone was homicidal and you had to warn the person, you had to you do your evaluation, and if you think it's a credible threat, you notify law enforcement, and you have to attempt to notify the person or persons that they threaten to kill. The case that James is referring to is how it became a duty to warn for harm, not just that someone was going to be killed. Was there was a case where someone was seeing a clinician, it may have been a psychologist, I don't remember the details exactly. And I think it was a guy that was like mad at his girlfriend, and afterwards he assaulted her, and I think like bit her finger off or something like that. It went to court, and they tried to get the clinician for saying, you know, that he didn't attempt to warn her. And his argument, his legal argument was he didn't threaten to kill her, which is what the law and the standard was at the time. So then it changed that if there is potential for physical harm, you have to attempt to warn as well. So that is for someone making a threat against others. It's become more popular in more recent history where you have to report that more because that's because of adolescents threatening to blow up their schools or shoot up their schools. So,
Gotta take it serious.
yes. What one's really similar to that one? That's a threat against someone else.
Suicide.
Suicide. So, if a client is suicidal, we'll go over this real quick. When you are evaluating, what are the primary three things we need to know in doing a suicide evaluation?
Plan.
Do they have a plan?
Access.
That's number 2. Do you have the means to carry it out?
Intent.
Number 3 is intent. So, can someone have a plan without being actively suicidal?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So as you are gathering that information, the more, if they have a plan, if they have the means, and if they have the intent, the more that they have, the more serious it is as far as getting them set up for an assessment to see if they need a higher level of treatment or care than what you can currently provide as an outpatient clinician. if they need to go inpatient. And if they don't cooperate with that, you need to notify law enforcement to do a wellness check, keep them safe. So, let's use an example real quick. Let's say someone's plan is to commit suicide by shooting themselves. Do they have the means to carry that out? Let's say it's an adolescent. You know, do you have a gun? No, I don't have a gun. Do you know how to get a gun? No, I don't know how to get a gun. They don't have the means at that point. It's different for an adult because any adult can go and buy a gun. You can't just go buy a gun as a child, so it's more difficult.
Well, this is Oklahoma.
And that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's
that's right.
probably an arsenal in the closet.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, what if the adolescent tells you, oh, I could get one from my friend, or I could go rob a place and get one or something, you know? They've thought it more through. They're, you know, they have the plan and they're thinking about getting the means, even though they may not currently have it. Sometimes people have a plan and a means, but they don't intend to act on it. In these situations, these are when you want to come up with your behavioral contracts and what they're going to do if their emotional state changes. Who are they going to reach out to for help? You or the police or, you know, Coates in Tulsa County or something like that. There is differing opinions on these behavioral contracts. In general, if someone signs their name to something, the research has shown people are more likely to do what they've signed their name to. There's also research that shows that the behavioral contracts for suicide don't necessarily prevent someone from committing suicide. My philosophy on that is I would do it anyway. On the off chance if it does help, it's not harmful to the client, and we'll be talking about that later, doing things, not doing harm. And the second thing is it protects you as well, you know. So, like I said, we want to protect our clients, but we also want to protect ourselves. If we do something to get in trouble, lose our license, we're not able to help people in that capacity anymore. So, is there anything else you wanted to mention on this page?
Just in the informed consent, whenever you're doing it, that's also the time that you have to talk about, we talked about fees, but dual relationships, bartering, and things like that, boundary crossing, and we will get into that in great detail because dual relationships and bartering can be tricky. And so near the end, we really get deep into the differences between them, and we'll really talk about openly what you guys think and what you would do and what you wouldn't do and where your personal ethics are. And hopefully we'll all grow together.
I don't want to move on yet.
Okay.
We only covered 3 of them. We're going to do the last 2.
Oh, okay.
But before we do those last 2, just to jump ahead a little bit where he's talking about dual relationships, the need for dual relationships now has greatly decreased because of teleservices. In the past, there are situations in a rural environment where you may have some kind of relationship in a small community and you may be the only clinician available for someone in that community to see. So the dual relationships rules are not as strict as in a city where there's multiple therapists that someone can choose to see. Because of teleservices now, that is starting to go away. That person in that community, they have access to teleservices, they're going to be able to see a different clinician in a different part of the state. You don't need to have those muddy dual relationship things. So that's becoming much more clear cut than in the past.
I wanted to add, because I'm in private practice also, I actually did an informed consent for dual relations based on the idea of COVID. Some of the clients I was seeing, or some clients, well, people that would become potential clients, didn't feel comfortable going in somebody else's office to see they knew that I was a counselor. And it was like, well, if I could see you, that would be great. I want to go to somebody else's office. I was like, that's great, because we got a relationship. And it's like, I ain't gonna go do counseling if I can't see you based on the idea of not feeling safe with that. So I actually did call the board, and it's like, well, the informed consent is of such, it is informed of what the situation is, and they understand the nature of therapy is going to be in this area, not that area, then they would be okay with it. So that's what I I did, and actually I created a form to basically say, hey, there was a potential for a dual relationship. This relationship was not affected by a dual relationship. This was gonna be a new one, so that the person who, based on the idea of COVID, knows things that this could be a area of them knowing that this could present that particular problem, so.
Right. So
Everybody understand, like everybody gets that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool, thanks for sharing that.
we're gonna get much more into that in the third hour of the presentation today. Because when there is that potential for dual relationships, there are very specific guidelines that you do have to follow.
Sounds
as
like you did a
were
great
saying.
job.
So, let's go over these other two, and then we're gonna wrap up the first. We will be taking a break at the end of each hour, so you'll be able to get up and stretch your legs here in a few minutes. Okay, what are the last two exceptions to confidentiality? Does anyone know? Last two categories. They're both legal.
Subpoena.
Oh, yeah.
If a judge, if you get an assigned court order by a judge, you have to break confidentiality in that case. Or if you don't, you'll face the legal consequences of it. But yes, I let my clients know that up front. I also let them know it has to be a signed court order by a judge. It's not just getting a subpoena from an attorney. Of all the cases that I know here through this agency, as far as I know, all of the cases with the exception of two have always been a situation, it's been a divorce situation, where a judge has signed a court order requiring us to turn over records of a child or children so that the court can make the determination which parent should be the primary custodial parent. So. Last one, it's a legal one as well.
Does it have to do with DHS?
No.
No?
It's been too long since I've given this presentation, I don't remember.
What if you get sued by a client?
Oh, that's right, yeah, if you get sued.
Oh.
You have a right to defend yourself in court. So, I let them know, if you, during the intake, if you would sue anyone that works here, they have a right to defend themselves in court. You have the right to break confidentiality to the extent that you would need to in order to defend yourselves. It's not just a free-for-all. You can't just be getting up there and trying to make the client look bad and providing details about their case that is not relevant to the court case, but you can to the extent that you need to in order to defend yourself. Turn this up a little bit so they can see this a little better. So when I tell clients about that though, I also let them know we've been in business as an agency for 12 years now, coming up on 12 years this July. We've never had a lawsuit, and I'm actually very proud of that for us. We currently have a staff of about 150. We have about 100, we have 13 locations throughout the state, so we have about 100 therapists on staff, about 20 case managers, about 20 undergraduate and graduate student, intern, and practicum students, and about 10 admin. So, over the years, we've had people work for us that don't work for us anymore, so, that's currently about 150, so we've had hundreds. And I let them know, anyone who currently works for us or who has ever worked for us in the past has never been sued work-related, We try to do things by the book, above board, prevent situations like that. We've done a good job of that so far. That's my expectation that we continue to do that. A lot of mental health, behavioral health places do have lawsuits. And a lot of times when they do get sued, they try to settle them out of court so that it doesn't show up on their record. And so we've never even had any of those situations where, there's been a lawsuit where we've even had to try to settle out of court or anything like that. So, I let them know that that's a possibility of confidentiality that could be broken in that situation, but we've never had to use it here. So that, I think, helps people feel better about that. So.
Yep.
Okay, those are the 5 exceptions 5 categories of exceptions to confidentiality. You ready to move on?
Oh, yeah.
All right.
All right, so what are we here for today? We might as well go ahead and define ethics. So it seems silly, but it's a good thing to at least have a clear-cut definition. So it's a noun, the moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. There are 5 ethical principles considered relevant to mental health care and counseling, and we do have the source sheets for where all of this information is cited. That will be available along with the PowerPoint presentation afterward as well. So we want to talk about, in the areas of mental health care, we're going to talk about autonomy, we're going to talk about justice, beneficence, non-maleficence, and fidelity. Does anybody want to take a stab at autonomy? What's autonomy? What do you think? What would you say autonomy is? The area of autonomy in ethics.
Personal choice, nobody being forced to do anything.
Very good. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. I mean, that's as concise as it gets. Is really letting the client be responsible for their care, and letting them be in charge. They have their own autonomy, right? So autonomy is the personal rule of the self that is free from both controlling interferences by others and from personal limitations that prevent meaningful choice. So one of the things that is important to talk about in autonomy is that if the person has some sort of self-limiting belief, they're not really in charge of their care, because they also have a belief system in place that's limiting their ability to be in charge of their own autonomy, right? So that's an area of autonomy that sometimes is questionable, and that's where your ethics comes in. You have to determine, is this something that this person is in charge of and they're autonomous for, or is this something that's controlling them that they are not aware of and they're not autonomous and in charge of, right?
So what's probably the common example people think of in mental health where someone does not have autonomy in treatment or care?
Setting their own goals.
Anyone that,
More extreme than both of what?
well, you
And what
have
both of you
an
said.
adult that's in an MRI, in an MR facility, they have to have that care because they are not.
Right,
And the
so,
same with a child, a teenager, any
so
person,
any facility.
yes.
So it's not as important for, not as prevalent in an outpatient setting, but for inpatient settings where someone is a danger to themselves or others. They're not in their right state of mind, and they may be administered treatment against their will. When you think of that, or lots of times people think of that, they think of movies and stuff where someone's being strapped down to a bed and they're being injected with medications and things like that. Which brings me to the point that I want to mention. That is the legal definition of a restraint. In outpatient counseling, we do not restrain clients. You don't do that, and you don't use that word in progress notes or something. If you have a child that you're walking out with the parent to the parking lot, to their car or whatever after their session, and the child's gonna bolt out into the parking lot, and there's a car coming, and they have the potential of getting hit, and you grab that child by their arm and pulled them back, you did not restrain that child. What you did was you therapeutically held that child.
Protected them from self-harm.
Yep.
No, that's a good point. One part of this slide that I always want to highlight is that professionals have an obligation to create the conditions necessary for autonomous choice in others. For a therapist or counselor, respect for autonomy includes respecting an individual's right to self-determination as well as creating the conditions necessary for autonomous choice. So. You broke it. All right. Did anybody have any questions about autonomy before we move on to justice? Okay. Does
We're
anybody-
gonna get through these 5 principles and then we'll take a break.
Yeah. Yeah, so whenever we talk about justice, we're talking about treating equals equally and unequals unequally. So what does that mean? Because in mental health care settings, justice is slightly different. When we're talking about justice, we're not talking about the same thing as whenever we're talking about justice in general. like in legal. Well, we're seeking justice. That's not what we're talking about in mental health ethics. So what do you think that means? Treating equals equally and unequals unequally, but in proportion to their relevant differences.
Fairness?
Fairness, that's, yeah, very good. Does anybody have an example of fairness? Like, is there a time whenever you might give a different piece of paper for an intake to one person versus another?
Having them in different languages, having access to an interpreter.
Absolutely, yeah. Somebody needs Braille,
You
somebody
also
needs
has
larger print.
those that cannot read.
Correct.
Mhm.
So what are some examples of how you would problem solve that? If somebody came in, how would you treat equals equally and unequals unequally in proportion?
If I didn't have access to that, then it would be reading the documentation to them.
Very good.
Explaining
Yeah.
what
Very
it was,
good.
make sure that they had questions.
Yep.
So that's what this is talking about. It's
Mhm.
making appropriate accommodations for clients based on their abilities.
And we have an example here. The example I use, an example of justice is that a counselor would give a person who's blind a form that is in Braille, or would go through the form with that individual orally instead of giving him or her a standard written form to fill out, but the counselor would treat him or her the same as any other client in all other regards.
Okay.
Beneficence. This is a fun word to say, and if you can make it on a Scrabble board, it's worth a lot of points. Beneficence is action that is done for the benefit of others. Beneficent actions can be taken to help prevent or remove harms or to simply improve the situation of others. So clinical applications. Professionals are expected to refrain from causing harm, but they also have an obligation to help. Ethicists often distinguish between obligatory and ideal beneficence. Ideal beneficence comprises extreme acts of generosity or attempts to benefit others on all possible occasions. So what do you think, what would you, given the difference between obligatory and ideal, what would you say is an obligatory beneficence versus an ideal beneficence? A situation where you have to do,
Like telling a client you have to make a do just report.
okay? Letting them know that you're gonna have to do that and that that's something that you have to do for the good, to cause good. Yeah,
So that's obligatory.
that's obligatory. Now, what would be ideal?
I think clinicians struggle or fall more into the ethical things with ideal
Mm-hmm.
beneficence. And it's not on the end of causing harm, it's on the end of causing good.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like
So-
if you have a teenager or a child and you explain everything to them, that the confidentiality, I can't just go and talk to your parent behind your back if you're just telling me something that is, normal things. But if there is something to do with you being harmed by yourself or somebody else or whatever, I have to
Right.
let your parents know this
That still
Because
falls
it's
on
for
the
your-
obligatory.
benefit, right?
Right.
But also,
So
legally,
on the other end, on the ideal, is a lot of times clinicians see the potential clients have
Mm-hmm.
of what they think would be good for them. So
And-
here's an example. Let's say you have a client that smokes and you think it would be beneficial for them to quit smoking. Is that their goal? That's where it comes into, we don't place our values.
Yeah, almost crossing the line of autonomy in pursuing ideal beneficence and trying to do the best thing for that client. You have the best of intent, but you might be crossing that line of autonomy by pushing for this ideal beneficence and trying to get the best version of your client out of them. But if that's not what they want, that's,
where does that come in as making a suggestion?
So let me do a short story real quick to explain this. And this is how I decided to go to graduate school. So becoming a counselor was not my the first thing I'd planned on doing. And so when Plan A didn't work out, I wanted to be a doctor at first. I started medical school and I didn't like it, so I quit. And I'd wanted to do that since grade school, and so I never had a Plan B. So when I went to college, the top two majors at the time getting into medical school were biology and psychology. I liked psychology classes, I majored in psychology. So here I am, I've left medical school, I have an undergraduate degree in psychology. What am I going to do? So I took a job, I'm living in Illinois at the time. And I took a job working as a psych tech at an inpatient substance abuse treatment facility. I worked on the adolescent campus. As a young adult studying psychology, my naive perception of psychology was, you're going to be working with people that want help, right? The facility that I worked at, almost all the adolescents there were court ordered to be there. They did not want to be there. So I'm working there, and I decide if I want to continue working in this field, I don't want to stay a psych tech, I want to become a counselor. I need to go to graduate school to do that, apply to go to graduate school. So the essay I wrote to get into graduate school was, I said, I want to go back to school and I want to get more skills and learn more to how to help people, how to motivate people, that society deems that they need to do this, that they themselves don't want to do it. So that's an example. This is where these are not always clear cut. It's not always black and white. There are gray areas. That is an example of ideal beneficence. Here you have a client who's using drugs, and they're at the point where they probably had legal consequences. They're in a facility. I don't know how much work or training you've had in working with addictions and stuff, but they say there are, once you become addicted, there are one of four outcomes. You're either going to end up in the legal system, you're going to end up in an institution, you're going to end up dead, or you're going to end up in recovery. Those are your options. So, in order so that to avoid the negative ones, the legal institutions, the mental health institutions are ending up dead, we are working with those clients and working on motivating them to change when initially they may not want that change. They just want to be left alone. They just want to do
Their addiction.
their drugs, their substances.
That's all they want.
So that's an example of ideal beneficence in a good way.
Mm-hmm. I can give you an example of a totally different industry. Back whenever I was a personal trainer, everybody I saw needed to be on an exercise program and a nutrition program, because that's the lens, right? Like that's your life. That's what you do every day. So one of the reasons why it's important to talk about ethics in mental health care and to talk about this stuff is because this is what you guys do every day. I mean, this is your lens. You're seeing people every day that either want help, need help, something, and so that can, the reason we talk about ideal beneficence is just like with me as a personal trainer, I'd look at everybody and be like, well, I know how to help you. You just need to get on an exercise program, get on good nutrition, you feel better, that'll fix your whole life. Because that was the lens, you know? So I think that's why we talk about it, that's why we discuss this, is so that our lens doesn't get too jaded, we don't start to cross those lines with ideal beneficence.
And that's why also when we write our treatment plans, on that very last tab, we have to put, when we develop it with the client, when do they know that they're done? And it has to be observable, it has to be measurable. You know, let's say they've come in for depression on a scale of 1 to 10 and they're at a 9, 10 being the worst. You know, maybe they're done, they're like, if I can get to a 5 or below and I can maintain within that range for a period of 2 months, I'm done with counseling. You know, they may hit that 5 and you may think, oh, they're doing great, they could do so much better, and you want them to continue. They may be happy where they're at. They may be done. Sometimes they're done, they go away, and sometimes they come back. But at that point, they've reached the point where they want to be then. Or you may discover something else in therapy that, oh, I really think they should work on this, I really think it would help improve their life, it may not be something they want to change or work on.
And so in those cases, a lot of times, ideal beneficence would include making the suggestion, but letting it go the minute that they say, I'm not interested.
Well, the
And then-
suggestion that I was talking about is when they are confused about different things, they don't know what to do and whatever, and my reply to them is, I cannot tell you
Right.
what to do. I can give you some suggestions that you can, choose from, but that's all I can do.
So that's our
Options.
job as a clinician, is helping them see things that they have blind spots to, that they haven't been able to see themselves.
Like, I never
And
thought
helping them
of
see that, and then they exploring with them, identifying those, and then processing with it. They decide whether or not they want to choose
Mhm.
one path versus another.
But you give them something to
Right.
think about.
Right.
Yep.
But also, a lot of times your client may come in and identify, this is when I will be done with therapy, and then they reach that point, and then they realize, I want to go further. So, when you do that update, that's when you change, okay, what's the new goal to finish
Right.
therapy? Or maybe they realize, hey, there is another issue in my life I'd like to work on. This is the new thing I want to work on. And then you change for when they'll be done. So.
And quite often, from what I've heard, that's the fun part, is whenever people are in that stage where they realize that things are going well and that they can do a little bit better. That's, when the few times it happens, that's awesome.
Well, and they've developed relationship with you, rapport and trust, and then they're like, hey, I'm actually benefiting from this, I want to continue, I want to
And they
improve
let
more,
you know,
benefit
you let
more.
them know if they're leaving. They think they're doing good enough to leave at this point, and you say, okay, you're welcome to come back at any time, call me if you want, anytime.
We have that happen with a lot of clients. They'll finish for a while and then, go on with their lives, and then they come back a year later.
Yes.
Sometimes it's for the same issue, and then you explore, what were you doing when you left, when you were well? Are you still doing that? And if they are, okay, let's explore, why isn't this working anymore? Sometimes they're coming back for a completely new issue, different issue, so.
I have seasonal allergies and I have to use an inhaler in certain parts of the year. I don't have to use it any other time. Doctors ask me, you have asthma? Not really, just whenever the pollen's out. All right, non-maleficence. This goes across several fields. If any of you have any medical background, you're already used to this. It's like the most common thing on Grey's Anatomy, where they're like, do no harm. That's really what we're focused on here. Non-maleficence is the concept of not causing harm to others, often explained as simply, above all, do no harm. This principle is considered by some to be the most critical of all the principles, even though theoretically they are all of equal weight, according to Kitchener in 1984, Rosenbaum in 1982, and Stadler in 1986. This principle reflects both the idea of not inflicting intentional harm and not engaging in acts that risk harming others. Again, more studies, Forrest Miller and Rubenstein, 1992. And these really are the studies that kind of laid the groundwork for ethics in medical and mental care. So, and then weighing potential harm against potential benefits is important in a counselor's efforts toward ensuring no harm. We want to empower and make people stronger, not do harm. Fidelity, last one. Fidelity involves the notions of loyalty, faithfulness, and honoring commitments. Clients must be able to trust the professional and have faith in the therapeutic relationship if growth is to occur. Therefore, the professional must take care not to threaten the therapeutic relationship or to leave obligations unfulfilled. What might be an instance of crossing a line of fidelity where a client may not trust you anymore? You didn't necessarily do anything illegal, but you lost the client's trust.
Not showing up.
Not showing up, absolutely, that breaks trust. Absolutely, not being on time, not showing up, yeah, that's a really good example. We want to try to do everything we can to make sure that bond and stays there, or at least that we're not the ones causing a violation of trust.
So when I do intakes, at the end of the paperwork, and I explain to the new client now, I say research has shown that about 80% of the effectiveness of therapy is dependent upon the relationship that's built between the client and the clinician. and only about 20% is dependent upon what the clinician actually knows. And so I tell them, if you're starting therapy and you feel like the person, your clinician, it's not a good fit, let us know. We have a lot of therapists on staff. I always tell them, let us know what you liked about the person and what you didn't like about the person, because the more information we have, the better job we can do trying to match you with someone more appropriately. Research has also shown that a lot of times clients don't feel comfortable letting anyone know if they don't think it's a good fit, which is very dangerous if you're working with someone in addiction. A lot of clients want their therapist to be pleased and happy with them. They don't want the therapist to feel bad that, you know, what they're trying isn't working. They don't, you know.
Another big problem right now is, like, even with improving lives, we're kind of short-staffed. Like, we got more people wanting sessions than we have people available to do them.
And that's not just us, that's throughout the whole state.
And so once someone gets in with a therapist and they've been on a waiting list, if they don't necessarily click, it's like, yeah, but what's the alternative? What else am I gonna do, right? So a lot of people are feeling just stuck, because better to have somebody that's not the absolute perfect fit than nobody at all.
I make sure when I start talking with a new client that comes in, I've been trained in body language and the voice and everything else, you know, and their movements. And I ask them when we're closer to the end of the session, if they feel like we are, you know, connecting, if they feel comfortable talking to me, that I notice that they, you know, kind of didn't want to make eye contact. I said, you know, and I asked them about, is that something you normally do?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you feel like we're not the right fit, that I'm not the right therapist for you? And it's okay.
Right.
It's perfectly fine, because that's just the same as you going to a doctor. You don't like that doctor, you go get you a different one.
Right.
And I said, it has nothing to do personally. And if you want someone else, then I'll make sure I'll request that, and you can do it also. But if you don't feel
Right.
like, you know, I don't wanna do that.
So that's
Then
what I
let me
want
do it.
to stress, that let them know that you'll let us know, but also tell them to call into the main
Right.
number as well.
Mhm.
But also, so I've had clients at that point ask me, well, is the therapist going to get in trouble if I ask to
Yeah.
switch? And I tell them no. They're not going to get in trouble. I said the only reason a therapist would get in trouble is if the reason you're requesting to be switched is because the therapist is doing something that's not being a good therapist. And so I give them an example. This has never been the situation. I make it extreme just to illustrate the point. But I say, if you called up and said, my therapist didn't show up for our last 6 scheduled appointments, which I don't know why anyone would keep coming, if that were the case, but I said, yeah, then the therapist would have a talking to at that point and finding out what's going on or whatever. But no, just because if you don't think it's a good connection, and then working with students, and I'm a state approved supervisor for LPCs as well, and working with licensure candidates and stuff. When you are first in the field, that's something that you have to realize, and that I tell them. Just because a client wants to switch, they don't think it's a good fit, is not a reflection on you. That does not mean you're not a good therapist. You can't take it personally. I mean, it's happened to all of us. It happens to me. And so the analogy I use to illustrate that is I tell them, think back to the first room for, like, not a kid, but like, an adolescent or adult or whatever. Think back to the first romantic relationship you had in your life, and when you realized that it wasn't working anymore. Because most people don't marry the very first person they ever dated. And because what happens is, a lot of times clients won't feel comfortable stating that they don't think it's a good fit, and then they quit therapy and they don't try again. And then they tell people, I tried therapy once, it didn't work for me. when you apply that to the romantic situation, that would be like telling people, I tried dating once, it didn't work for me, and then you never go on a date the rest of your life. And then when I explain it to people that way, they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, you know, so. You know, if someone goes and sees someone in a private practice, you know, there's not necessarily anyone else there to switch to if it's just an individual practice. Sometimes clients don't feel comfortable switching to another clinician in a small group practice because they don't want to run into that person again and stuff. You know, we have multiple locations, we have multiple clinicians, you know, we can try to help you out, and if we don't have someone, you know, then they can be referred out someplace else.
I just keep thinking it's just going to be a win-win when we allow that person to be truthful with us. Because in the years I've worked, I mean, there have been, you know, clients that either they weren't, I wasn't a good fit, or the therapist wasn't a good fit. And I remember even last, couple of years ago, I had a client that at that time we weren't a good fit. And then recently, they requested me. And so I think when we let go, and we let go of whether it's control or, you know, what we think of ourselves and we don't take it personal, like sometimes it even comes back to us.
Yeah.
So it's a win-win for all.
Okay,
That's a
so
powerful thought.
this is the last thing I want to mention before our first break today. So James mentioned waiting list. There are 3 contributing factors that I'm aware of why there are so many people seeking services and why there are waiting lists throughout the state. Number 1, Oklahoma passed Medicaid expansion a couple years ago, a few years ago, which allowed, I think it was 180,000 more people to qualify for services that weren't qualifying. Number 2, in order to become a licensure candidate now, the board changed the rules a couple years back that a person has to pass the National Counselor exam before they can become a candidate. So it's become more difficult to become a counselor candidate. So it's slowed, the number of people entering the field has slowed down, because if they don't pass that test, they have to wait 3 months before they can retest. So we have more people seeking services, less people providing services, and because of the higher demand, you had a lot of people that quit taking like Medicaid clients. That they're like, I'm only taking private insurance now. You have certain clinicians that are only doing private pay now. And then the last thing is what's been going on the past few years with COVID. Oklahoma ranks number 3 in the country for people with anxiety and depression. So, I mean, seriously, our biggest challenge right now is hiring, and it is for a lot of places, hiring more clinicians. So we still do a pretty good job. We're one of the better ones as far as getting people in pretty quickly. Prior to COVID, we would get on average 10 to 15 new referrals a day. Recently, we set a personal record. We got 44 referrals in one day. That is more than a caseload for a therapist. When we're getting that many people seeking services daily, I could hire a new therapist every day of the year and still have enough clients for everyone to see. Prior to COVID, I had 2 therapists who primarily all they did were intakes, assessment, and treatment plans. And now we have like 6 or 7 therapists doing them. So depending on who gets assigned to one of those people, the goal from the beginning of the company was to get people scheduled within half a week. You call in the first half of the week, we want you scheduled by the second half of the week. That's why the clinicians are supposed to be checking their business emails at least once a business day and responding back within 2 business days. Depending on who the client gets assigned to, they're getting scheduled sometimes within the same day up to about 3-4 weeks out. Some people complain about that. We had one person call in and they were told, you know, it may take up to 3 weeks. And they were like, I'm not waiting. I'm gonna go somewhere else. And they told us where they were going. I don't remember where it was. They called back the next day and they said, oh, I contacted that other place and they have a 6-month waiting list.
Yeah.
We got a referral of someone that had contacted us, that had contacted someplace else first, and this was in February, and they were told that that place had an 11-month waiting list.
Wow.
And so I'm like, if you wait for that, it's
11
February.
months.
Like, you are not gonna be seen until January of 2023. There are lots of places right now that have 6-month plus waiting list, and we're still doing a pretty good job of getting most people in within a month at the far end.
So I have a pretty new client. His referral came from his PCP, and he was
Uh-huh.
like, "I can't even believe you're seeing me already."
Mhm.
He was like, "My doctor told me it'd be 6 months."
Mhm. All right, does anyone have a question before we take our first break? Nope, okay, we're gonna stop there, let's take about a 10-minute break. Let's be back around 12:35. So,
Thanks, everyone.
has everyone been in this building before, at this office? When you go out this door and turn to the right, the restrooms are on the left.
Okay.
We're in the north, this is the north hallway of the building, those are the older restrooms that haven't been remodeled yet.
Okay.
If you want the newer ones, the building makes a big rectangle, so you can stand up right over here. If you go up the west hallway on the left, those are the 3 newly remodeled restrooms if you want to use
Okay, no,
them. Newer, nicer restrooms.
I don't need anything.
The
They
vending
are much
machine
nicer.
stole my
There's
quarters.
a vending machine in the front.
But ours are
Yeah.
okay.
I figured,
What about the one out in Poland?
It wouldn't even take my dollar. The
What,
dollar bill wouldn't take it.
For the soda or the snacks?
The sodas.
Okay.
I tried to get a Diet Dr. Pepper in it.
Have you tried the one that's just down the hallway here at the front?
It wouldn't
door?
take my dollar. That one wouldn't. So I went to.
Let me see if I can get it to work for you.
That's all right.
Pause that.
I'm gonna break this up into 2 parts and go ahead and stop this one for now.
Okay. Did you,
Things she was sharing with me in the last 3 years.
Oh, that's good.
So I'm really, it's exciting to hear a therapist say, because now I can even, just that little nugget you just shared, helps me understand Sophia's body. And what she was saying is exactly how you were explaining her body, like not the physiology, the
Polyvagal. I don't want to.
it was good, anyway, it was good.
all right, let's get started on this again. This photo. Back up. Let me start this again.
Anybody have trouble finding a restroom or anything like that? I know the vending machine swallowed a lot of quarters.
We'll look into that. All right, we've gone a little over time on the first hour, so we didn't do the last slide before our break, so we'll jump back and do this one real quick.
So we're gonna go ahead and cover the 4-step model of ethical decision-making in mental health care and step.
Real quick, just real quick for a second, for anyone on Zoom or on whatever this is, Google Meet,
Google
if
Meet.
you're having trouble hearing still, closed captioning helps a little bit.
Oh,
Just
great.
wanted to put that out there.
Okay.
It has auto-generated captions, that's awesome. So,
Next time I'll have to try to do it with a different laptop and try to do it with the webcam on the laptop and that microphone instead of my phone, which is what I'm using this time.
It is much better than it was before, though.
Oh, good.
That's good.
Awesome. So we start with step one. In step one, we're going to recap what we just learned about the 5 different competing moral principles. So let's go back over them again. What was the first one? You guys remember? Autonomy. And then justice. What's the next one? Beneficence. Beneficence, right?
Non-maleficence.
Non-maleficence, and then the last one?
Fidelity.
Fidelity, perfect. So using those 5 competing moral principles, we identify what the issues are. So you use those 5 competing moral principles to assess the person's condition and how to move forward with that person. That's step 1 in the 4-step model. Second step is to gather information. This is whenever you do your obtain consent, identifying all involved and affected parties, and try to do your best to use logic and reason rather than your emotions. During this portion, you're not allowing yourself to become too emotionally attached to the outcomes, to this person's situation. You're trying to use logic and reason to help them find the best solution and steps forward. And then in 3, we want to brainstorm. This is the part where we're really going to let their autonomy get involved. We're going to brainstorm together and come up with outcomes, modalities that we're going to use, possible alternative treatments, whether or not we're going to involve any other professionals, things like that. All these things are brainstorming that we want to go over. And some of these things are going to be potential things that we do. They're not all, during the brainstorming session, you're not going to do everything that you talk about, right? You're just going to kind of try to find the best solutions. And then finally, choosing and taking a course of action, referring back to 1 and 2. So once you've come to a conclusion, you get to the end of the 4-step model, you then want to go back and recheck it against the 5 principles and make sure that the outcomes, the modalities, the alternative treatments, that they all fall into that care, right? And then you want to ask yourself, would I do the same for others that I'm doing for this particular client? And that's just that area of justice and making sure that you're not crossing into that, not treating equals unequally and unequals equally and things like that. What if everyone knew about the way that I was dealing with this client? Would they be okay with it? My colleagues, other professionals, the public, anybody that found out the way that I treated this person, if everybody knew, would I be okay with that? And then finally, is it fair to everyone involved? Yourself included. Right? So that's the 4-step model of ethical decision-making in mental health care. All right, let's take a break. We could have knocked it out, right? All right, so here's a few red flags. It's just a short list. It's not a complete list. And then, obviously, I'm going to ask you guys if you have any red flags that immediately for you would be like, if I heard somebody was doing that, no way. So, short list of examples of practices to avoid. Professional does not have sufficient and or specific training to address issues and or attempts to treat problems outside the scope of the practice. Now, I am a hypnotist. I am not a therapist of any kind, so in the state of Oklahoma, I am not allowed to say anything about hypnotherapy, okay? And here's what's weird. As a therapist, even if you're not trained in hypnosis, technically, legally, you can use the term hypnotherapy all you want, because you are a therapist. So you can use modalities. Even if you aren't specifically trained in hypnosis, you could call yourself a hypnotherapist. So one of the things that I do in hypnosis is I'm very particular and strict about what I will work with people with hypnosis, and I'm very particular and strict about telling them I am not a mental health care professional and I'm not a therapist. I do not do hypnotherapy, I do hypnosis. So that's one thing where I make it very clear, and I will not, there's a lot of things that I won't, like pain management is an area I will not touch with hypnosis, because in my opinion, if there's pain there, there's something wrong. And if all I do is help you isolate that and move that to a different part of the brain to where you're no longer conscious of the pain, I didn't fix the problem. All I did was make you less aware of the pain. So that's not something I'll do. I've done it for myself, but I won't do it for others.
So that's like when I train people how to write their notes. I always tell them the theoretical model you're using primarily, and this is how I was trained as well, you're always gonna put the word techniques at the end, unless you actually are certified in it. Yvonne is certified as a brain spotting therapist, so she can say, I do brain spotting therapy. If I had some brain spotting training, but I'm not certified, I would, and if I used some of those techniques in a session, I would say I use brain spotting therapy techniques. The theoretical motto I primarily follow is cognitive behavioral therapy. I am not a certified cognitive behavioral therapist. So in my notes, I don't write that I do cognitive behavioral therapy. I write that I use cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. So if you had some kind of training in hypnotherapy, don't call yourself a hypnotherapist.
I wouldn't.
Say that you use those techniques, unless you are actually certified in what you're doing.
And there's not very many in Oklahoma, so, that are actual hypnotherapists, so it's a very alternative treatment style. It's accepted, and insurance does cover it, but you have to be licensed therapist and you have to be certified in hypnosis to bill for hypnotherapy. Professional does not show interest in the changes desired or the client's goals for therapy. That boils down again to autonomy. We have to let them be in charge of the outcomes.
Don't put your values on, don't think you know better than them. The client says they want to move towards this goal and you're thinking, oh, I think it'd be better if you did this, and you're like trying to steer them a different way. Red flag, don't be doing that.
And sometimes it's not so intuitively clear to us when we might be kind of putting our values on other people. It is something that you have to check and double check sometimes, because a lot of these things are what lie in what we call substructures of belief, meta models of how your understanding of reality is structured in an unconscious way. So like the subconscious things that you learned as a child about how the universe works and how relationships work, those are some things that you may not even be aware of that you have inside your processing. So we have to double check and make sure that we're confirming with the client that we're hearing the outcomes that they want, and that we're confirming back to them that we are hearing them correctly, and that we're not layering in our own stuff over that. So.
And that's part of the reason why we're required to get continuing education every year, is because we are supposed to be staying up on things. Things change, new techniques come out. We are supposed to continue to learn. We're supposed to continue to grow. That's why consultation and staffing your cases with other professionals is a good idea and stuff. People will talk to me about, thinking back over their a session they had and what they could have done different, things like that. And I always tell them, in my opinion, those are the clinicians that make the best therapists. The ones that I'm worried about are the ones that never think about it, you know? Because they're not thinking about it, they don't change anything, they're not growing. And I tell the students that I work with and the licensure candidates, I learn so much from them too. And I told them, my primary theoretical model that I follow is cognitive behavioral therapy. If that's not the one that you are choosing, when you're staffing cases with me, let me know what techniques from the model you're trying to use, what you're trying to do. Because next year will be 20 years that I graduated from graduate school. I don't think brain spotting was around 20 years ago, was it? I mean,
If it was, it wasn't referred to in that terminology. It might have just been emerging.
An idea.
Yeah, an idea, a concept.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. New techniques come out and stuff, and so I tell them, if you point out to me, I am, this is the model I'm trying to do, and this is the technique I'm trying to use from it. This was the situation, or I observe it in person, or I watch the video or whatever, or they're just staffing it in supervision, verbally, orally. Then I tell them I can give you feedback on it. But if you don't tell me that, I'm trying to do this technique, even though I've had theories classes and, I knew enough to pass the NC and all that, like I said, it's been 20 years, that may not be at the forefront of my mind because that's not the model I primarily follow. And you may be trying something, but if you don't mention to me, I'm trying this technique, it may go over my head, and I might not remember, oh, that's a technique from that model and stuff, and so then I may not be able to give them feedback on it.
Yeah, I'll say this much. One of the things I've loved about conducting the workshops with Kneale is every single time I learn from the attendees. I walk away more educated. And am I using it in a therapeutic sense? No, but my relationships improve. I mean, you know, at home and business relationships, I'm able to work with people and be able to identify problem areas and help people in ways subtly, just from learning from you guys. So it's been awesome to get to be a part of this. So really appreciate you guys letting me be here. So 3 and 4 in my mind kind of go together. But professional cannot or does not clearly define how they can help solve whatever issues which have led a client to therapy. I call this psychobabble. If you get across from somebody and they can't clearly articulate what their approach is, what outcomes you are looking for, and it seems like they just have a bunch of word salad of psychology terms, and at the end of it, you're sitting there going, what? I don't understand still what we're doing. What are we doing? So I have a lot of red flags around anybody who can't tell me what it is they do, if they can't explain it. So professional does not provide an explanation on how a client will know when therapy is complete. I think that one kind of goes overlooked a lot because so often clients don't have a goal when they come in. And so I think quite often you can kind of just be like, hey, the goal is right now showing up. And sometimes we don't move past that and recheck that after a few times of them showing up. We don't recheck like, okay, now that you're showing up, what are the outcomes and what are the goals? So if somebody's been going to therapy for a while and they're talking to me about it, and then I ask them, what's the end game? Like, how are you gonna know whenever you're feeling better, and like what's kind of the outcome you're looking for? And if they have no idea, that to me is a bit of a red flag. Yes, ma'am.
So when I do rehab, because that's the case management too, is I get to teach, according to their treatment plan. And something I find that's working for my clients is I ask all my people to bring a journal or a notebook, and if they can't, I'll supply one for them. And then before every session, I ask them to date it. And so my clients know, we're gonna date it and then write down 3 goals that pertain to their treatment plan. And literally, and then before every session, we go back and we look at the 3 goals or the 2 goals that they had last week. And then I ask them, and we look at the goals that they set today. But just reviewing their goals in their notebook, and then seeing if they are making progression or if they're stuck, or if we need to review over last week's. Because when I wasn't doing that, it was, and I take notes in my journal, but making them do that work has really helped just keep us on track and know how we're moving ahead and outcomes and stuff.
Have you found that they can articulate more clearly whenever they are achieving goals and things like that, milestones? Is that?
They're more, they can articulate, and they also can, I lost the word, when we have to redirect, they can sometimes even personally self-redirect themselves.
Make a bit more reflective.
So
that's like what James was talking about. Sometimes someone comes in and they don't have a clear idea of what the goal is. They just know they're hurting and they want to stop hurting at that point. That's the result.
Sure.
I'm feeling this emotional pain and I don't like that. I don't want to feel this, whatever. And that's what he was talking about. Your first few times the goal may be come here, they just may need someone to talk to and load and stuff, and then you help them with the tools to be able to formulate the goal and what it is they really want, and to be able to communicate that. I do something similar with my sessions of what you were talking about, Sandra, especially when I work with children. When I work with children, the approach I like to take is I like to mix my session up. Part of my session I like to have very directive, and then the other part, I like it to be more open and spontaneous. When I do the directive part, and CBT is very much like a homework and stuff, but I'm going to have a very specific objective that I'm wanting them to grasp for that session. And then the next time I meet with them, we spend the first part of that session talking about what do you remember from the previous session? Because if they don't remember that, they didn't grasp it, they didn't catch it. And so I'm going to spend some more time on that objective before moving on to the one that I had planned for the session for that day.
Yes.
That's really good. Does anybody else have an idea, like a good idea, suggestion? Do you have a template or anything that you like to incorporate in your sessions that kind of helps with some of that? I have one that I call the Pure model. I have it says P U R E, and then I make them go through it. And on the top line, it's first we have to positively state what we do want, not what we don't want. And so, because it's like you said, somebody comes in and says, I want to quit smoking. I say, okay, you're telling me what you don't want. So why don't you tell me what you do want? Well, I want to be somebody in control of my health, and I no longer want to smoke. Well, great. Okay, so that's sort of moving into that more positively stated. So try to get them first to switch their language pattern from negatively stating the situation that they're in, because also, as you know, that you're reliving what once you're saying it. Like if I say, don't imagine a black cat running across the table, what happens? So you start reliving that thing. I don't want to feel this anymore. Well, then you begin feeling that thing you don't want to feel. So the first thing I want to do is kind of shift them into a positive emotional and mental state. So I start getting them to focus on what they do want, not what they don't want. And then we move to you, and so we make it under their control. So whatever the goal is, whatever positive change we want, I don't want anyone else to be responsible for it. So I make it under their control. What are the changes that you want that you can control, not things you can't control? Then I make it real. So to make things real, I want to have visuals. I want to know what it's going to look like. I want to know what it's going to sound like, and I want to know what it's going to feel like. So the more real I can make it, I want to make it like them to see it, make it tangible. Because it's just abstract and imaginary until we start to make it tangible and give it physical characteristics and attributes. And then finally, we double check and make sure it's ecologically balanced, meaning that it's not going to affect anyone negatively in their life, including them, that it's only going to have positive effects. I'll give you an example. I got to this point with one person who came to me for hypnosis to quit smoking, and we got to that point, and she said, I said, is this going to negatively affect any relationships in your life? You quitting smoking, is there anything bad? And she was like, oh, shoot. And I was like, what's wrong? And she was like, well, every night whenever I get home from work, my husband and I, we go out on the back patio and have a cigarette, talk about our day, and that's how we unwind. It's our thing. Like, that's what we do. And I said, oh, okay. And I said, well, I mean, do you need to talk to him before we move forward in this process? Do you need to make sure that you guys are okay, that this is not going to negatively affect that relationship? And she was like, I'm sorry, I do. I need to go and talk to him. So I didn't hear from her. I just figured she didn't want, to do anything about it. So she calls me 2 weeks later and she says, guess what? What? She's like, I'm down to smoking 1 cigarette a day. When? Whenever I get home from work, I go out on the back patio and I have 1 cigarette with my husband. I said, oh, does that work for you? Are you happy? She said, from 2 packs a day? Yeah, I'm happy. Didn't even need the session. All we had to do was go through the Pure model. Once she had it clear and once she knew what the problem was, she fixed it herself. Didn't even need me. So a lot of times just doing that Pure model, people will get to the bottom of it, and quite often, and I think that's the goal in all of this, is in making those things clear, is quite often that does the majority of our work for us, is if we can just get to what the positive outcome would look like.
So the first part of that model that he was talking about, I use that a lot with kids again, and then talking with their parents, when the parents upset the kids doing something they don't want them to. And so we talk about reframing and focusing on, okay, how can you focus on what your expectation is, what you want, instead of focusing on what the child's doing that you don't want. One of the consequences I talk to parents about with their children and stuff is having kids write sentences. if, you know, they did something to get in trouble.
We just had a request pop up and I didn't see it, but.
Okay, I'll get there in just a second.
Okay.
Yeah, Tracy answered it. So let's say the child's not telling the truth, lying. You know, instead of having the child write a sentence like, I will not lie, what she's talking about is you're reinforcing those words and stuff. You would change it to like, I will tell the truth.
And I'll feel positive about it. I'll feel great whenever I'm honest, you know, things like that, reframing it, because that's guilt and shame whenever we focus on the negative behavior. It's just re-traumatizing that person to re-experience that, and it really it's a negative model in my opinion. But quite often, you know, if that's a model that you learned, you know, that's gonna be your language pattern toward your children, you know. I quite often tell people whenever a kid's, you know, stuck in a tree and you don't want them to fall, you say, hold on tightly. You don't say, don't fall. Because immediately, you know, just like that, don't look down. Everybody looks down, you know, and so you really are conditioned to relive that negative thing because we're taught that you'll be averse to it, and so you'll go the opposite direction because you want to distance yourself from that negative emotion. But what really happens is once we start to feel it, we can't stop from feeling it. It becomes this echo chamber, and it keeps fueling itself. The more you feel it, the worse you feel. The worse you feel, the more you feel it.
So like an example of that I use in my personal life is I try not to say if I didn't do something, like I try not to tell someone like, oh, I forgot to do that, because I don't want to reinforce that word forgot in my mind. So I'll say, I didn't remember to do that. I want the word remember in my mind. So, and then the example that James did with the woman that wanted to quit smoking is a perfect example of a clinician not putting their values on the client. You could have a clinician in that situation and be like, oh, well, she's still smoking a cigarette a day, you know. We have to get her not to smoking any at all.
And I mean, initially, that is what she came to me and said she wanted.
Right, initially. And then it changed.
Yep.
Her goal changed. And then she was
In
happy
real
where
time.
she was at. So.
Yeah. Professional is judgmental or critical of behavior, lifestyle, or problems. Just reiterating what we just said. We don't want to be critical of somebody else's lifestyle, anything, problems or behavior. And that's a big one too. Is you know, sometimes we equate people's, you know, problems and them, you know, and that, or they do, and so that's really why whenever we do layer in a judgment on someone else because of their problems, they will feel it personally. And so that's why that's really important. Whether you know it's coming through your micro expressions and your tone and things like that, they know. They're feeling it. So
that's why I try to be conscious in not defining a client by their diagnosis. You know, a client will come in and they'll say, I'm bipolar. You're not bipolar. You may have been diagnosed with bipolar. So
I struggle
you are
with.
not.
I've been diagnosed with. Yeah. It's really important that it doesn't become a part of your personality. You know.
And it's interesting that it seems like people do that more with like mental health than like physical health.
Absolutely.
You get diagnosed with cancer, you don't say, I'm cancer.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Little
I was
kids,
diagnosed with
little
cancer,
kids
you know?
do that too.
Yep.
Because they'll come, you know, and they'll say, I'm ADHD. And I'm like, you are? What is that?
Who told you?
I don't know.
Yep.
But my mom and daddy said I'm ADHD. That's what they tell, you know, my teacher. And I'm like, do you know what that means? No.
Yep.
So it's like, you're putting a label on kids that are gonna remember it for the rest of their lives, and they're, oh, I'm ADHD, well, when'd you find that out? You know?
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, when I was a kid, and I said, oh, you saw a psychologist, or, no,
Yeah.
and it's
Mom
just,
told me.
yeah, or teachers, and,
Yeah.
oh, you're ADHD, you know, you've got.
That
so-
just reminded me of what we were talking about before about practicing outside your scope of practice.
Right.
We are not physicians. We don't tell clients, you need this medication. You know, if I do the continuous performance test, ADHD test that helps determine whether someone meets the clinical criteria for ADHD. If they do, I'll have the conversation with them that based on your scores, you know, a lot of people that have these scores on this test, if they take these results to a physician, a lot of times they have been prescribed, you know, a stimulant or a non-stimulant. I go over what they are and stuff. But I don't tell them, you know, you need this medication stuff. That's outside my scope of practice. That's outside my area of expertise. But I do have people come in and, oh, well, my teacher said I need this medication. Really, is your teacher a doctor? No, well then, you know,
Psychiatrist.
then you need to go talk to a doctor about it. So.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Professional blames or encourages blame of family, friends, or partner of client. Do you guys have any examples of that? You ever seen anything like that or heard of anything like that? I have experienced it before. I've been on the receiving end of it, where it seemed that whenever the person would come out of the session, that I was the problem afterward. And so I, you know, in exploring and trying to get to the bottom of it, that was not the case. The therapist was not encouraging blame of a family or partner or anything, but that was what the person was taking from the session whenever they would come out. And so that was the message they would deliver to me, but that's not actually what was ever happening. It was just in the mind of the person that was having the sessions. And so after a little while, eventually, we got to the bottom of it, and that was not the case, but it did seem that way. So I just want to make sure that everybody, you know, make sure that you're focused on the client and not, you know, expanding that out to those other circles. Because if there is another person that's a problem, that's something that probably needs to be reported. So if it gets to that point. So I don't know that you need to blame to the client about that person that is problematic until it's been reported, until you get to the bottom of things. But you may have something to add on
Well,
that.
even like the model you're talking about, you have them take responsibility for what can they do in the
What's inside
situation.
of your
So if they come in and their problem is, my problem is because of how my spouse is acting,
Right.
or whatever. Okay, well, you can't control your spouse.
Right.
You know, like, okay, well, what can you do?
Mhm.
You know, they can decide whether they're gonna put up with it, or if they're gonna leave that situation, or how they can react to that situation. But it needs to be focused on what they can do. It's not just a session where you just gang up and badmouth their spouse.
I've
Like,
been on
that's
the
not gonna be helpful.
receiving end as a therapist
Yeah,
of a
yeah.
spouse.
And that just comes in and
That's like,
kinda-
no, she's the problem. She's ruining our marriage, when really it's just the woman's realizing that she's in a domestic abuse situation.
Yeah.
And how her empowerment is like, whoa, I can't keep doing this to me and my kids.
Mhm.
And you'll get that with parents sometimes too. You know, my kid's the problem, drop them off, fix my kid. You know, when a lot of times it's not. And that would just leads me to mention this right here. There are a couple of different philosophies on working with kids if their parent or guardian aren't going to be involved. Now, some therapists, their philosophy is, if I'm not going to get family involvement, I'm not going to
That's me.
work with it. That's not the philosophy I take. The philosophy I take is because kids can't choose the situation, the environment that they're in. So if I'm in a situation like that, I will still work with the child, and I will work with them to say, let's figure out the way that you can function as best you can while you're in this situation until you're old enough to get yourself out of the situation. So
That's what I do with the adolescent clients I have,
Mhm.
that their parents won't have any kind of.
But just from my own observation, from when I did work substance abuse treatment with adolescents, the ones that were successful are the ones that had family involvement. They're the ones who are, the families are showing up for their family sessions and stuff. Their track record, they're much more successful than the kids whose family weren't involved, they weren't coming for family therapy, they weren't showing up.
Well, that's what turned me off from working with anybody younger than 11, 12. Is the parents would drop them off, be like, why isn't my kid changing? Well, you're beating them up at home, you know, and there's all DHS involvement and everything else, and they still won't participate in therapy, so it's
Yeah, they don't need
like,
it.
come on. Right.
Yeah, you can start to feel kind of helpless in that situation.
Yeah, it just became exhausting and
Yeah.
sad, so.
One of the
Not my
important
niche.
parts about ethics is that we do have to kind of sometimes find our line on how we can take care of ourselves. Self-care is really important for you to be able to stay healthy and take care of more people. You have to be able to do that in a way that's best for you.
I want to say something along those lines. One of the first things I tell my clients, never, ever go to a therapist who doesn't have a therapist.
That's a really good point too. Or at least not somebody who advocates strongly that everybody should feel comfortable going to one. Because again, you know, if you're, see, I also think that therapists should be seeing therapists. That's my personal opinion. However, I do know that we go through seasons, you know, like you may have times when you need to be seeing your therapist and times when you don't.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, like, yeah, so.
But definitely
But not
advocating for it.
for
Consistent.
someone that's like resistant to seeing.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, I mean, once a year check-in is just healthy.
Yep.
Because how can we advocate for therapy for others when we don't do that ourselves?
I agree with you. I'm not a strict adherence to that, but I agree with you. I think it's a very good idea.
I think a lot of grad schools offer free therapy to their counseling students. I know the one that I went to did, and it was encouraged that you did it so that you experienced being the client and being on the receiving end of
That's what I was
therapy.
thinking.
That's what one of my instructors when I was doing it with OU, that was, everybody in here is going to go see a therapist. Pick one, I don't care how long you're there, you're gonna go in there the first time and you're gonna know what it's like for your patient or your client when they come in to see you. And
I mean, that's a good point too. If you've never had to sit out in that waiting room and, you know, that feeling to do the intake process and everything, that's a good point. So I really hadn't even considered that component, you know, having to go through the process, just the experience of being a new patient, a new client. That's
yeah,
a good point.
then you had to come back and tell how it felt for you.
Mhm.
And then play the role play with your other class, you know.
That's good. That's really good. Role play is really important in everything you do. Professional often talks in word salad or psychobabble form, which leaves the client confused. Just reiterating more of that, the client not having a clear understanding.
Before we move on, I want to share a story real quick of a child that I worked with without family involvement many, many years ago. It was before Improving Lives existed or anything. And this parent would, the office where I worked at, like, the child was, I think, second grade. And the parent wouldn't, wouldn't even walk the kid into the building, just like pull up on the street, outside in front of the sidewalk.
Yeah.
You know, the kid just opens the door, gets out, and the parent wouldn't stay there, and the parent would take off. So I'm in session with this child one time, and we're on the floor of my office playing a therapeutic board game, and all of a sudden, this kid's eyes rolled back and into the back of the head. And I could tell the child was feeling afraid, you know, so, you know, I encouraged the child, close your eyes, you know, I'm here, I'm gonna put my hand on you, and I helped lay the child back on the floor and stuff. I contacted the parent, and I was like, you know, there's something medically wrong with your child. Are you close by? Like, you know, can you be here to take your child to the hospital, or do I need to call an ambulance? And the parent was like, you know, I'm right up the street, I'll be right there. So the parent got there and got the child to the hospital. The child was okay and everything. What happened, though, was that child had a sibling, and the child and the sibling both had medication to take. And the parent had put the medication on the counter for the kids to take, and the kid that I was seeing grabbed the wrong set of pills. And so was taking medications that wasn't meant for that child, it was meant for a different child, and it caused that child to have a seizure.
Man,
And
it's terrifying.
so, you know, when the parent got there, they, I don't know, called or texted or whatever, and it was a small, you know, a small child, I guess, I picked the child up and carried the child out to the parent's car, you know, but, so.
Anybody else got a?
What was the risk in that if that child really needed an ambulance and needed some type of medical assistance? How would that fall back on the therapist that you call the parent instead of getting professional emotional, medical help.
I think in that case, I mean, the child was still coherent, and I was still able to have a conversation, and like I was calming the child down and just talking, and, we're gonna get your mom here, and we're gonna get you checked out by a doctor and see what's going on, figure out what's going, keep you safe and stuff. If the child had just passed out, I probably just, and like wasn't responsive, I would have just called an ambulance right away. But in this case, like I said, the first sign to me was the eyes just rolled in the back of the head, which scared the child, and that's why I had the child close their eyes, because they're not getting the messed up visual stimuli and stuff. So keep your eyes closed. I'm going to put my hand on you. I'm going to help lay you down on the floor, so that they wouldn't fall over or anything. And like I said, when I contacted the parent, and the parent was right up the street. I mean, they were right there. Honestly, the parent probably got there and got the kid to the hospital faster than if an ambulance would have been called, so. But just based on the situation in those circumstances in that time, at that time, that's what I thought was best at that time.
And a lot of this
there can
stuff-
be different circumstances
Yeah.
that, I'm not saying that's a hard and fast rule.
Yeah, a lot of things today are gonna be best practices.
Situations, a student in school, I'm a school counselor, and the student was told out. So I was teaching charge that day, no principal there, so I had to take charge. I did call the mom, but I called EMSA too, because the child was not responding. But the health clerk, not nurse, health clerk in school got upset because I didn't go through her.
Okay.
I was like, health clerk? No. But this child was out, and I was, and really was having a seizure as well. But all I know is I couldn't respond to her, and she didn't respond back.
I would have called the ambulance too.
Yeah.
As a parent,
Oh, yeah.
I would have
That would
wanted to call
that would've
the
been an
ambulance.
instant call.
In that situation, yeah, if the kid's not responding, I wouldn't worry about what any
I
other
would not have
adult
wanted to
said.
go to the
That's what I was gonna say, is a lot of things that we talk about today, the reason that we like to get into specifics is, at the end of the day, a lot is gonna rely on best practices for that situation. And like Neil said, it's not gonna be a hard rule.
Yeah.
So that's why we're here.
Well, I think that's also a situation where a potential parent could be like, you just cost me an ambulance bill.
True, yeah, if
You
it's
know, and
unnecessary.
then, so for us, it's like,
Right.
what do we do? Well, I'm gonna do what I feel is right, clearly.
So like in that situation, that person may not have wanted the ambulance called to the school because they might think it reflects badly on the school or whatever. So I worked at a place in the past where there was a client who was a child who had previously physically attacked a therapist that worked there, who was the child's mother's therapist. And in this particular situation, the child had pulled out, I think it was a switchblade or something, and was mad at the therapist and had threatened to kill her. And I was planning on calling the police, and the place that I worked at the time did not like to have the police called, because then they had to document that as a critical incident report, and they thought it looked bad on them when they would have their accreditation audits and stuff. They didn't want the police called. In that situation, they were able to get the mom and the child out of the office building without the police being called and stuff. But I think if something had happened, I think they still would have been liable for sending a client out, even though it left with the parent, with the mom, with a knife, who just threatened to kill a therapist with it.
And as a therapist, I'd be thinking, well, thanks for caring about my well-being.
Right. Yeah.
So what had actually previously happened with this was,
And you don't work there anymore, is that right?
right. The mom didn't have someone to watch the child, and she had a therapy session scheduled with her therapist, so she had the child in her therapy session with the therapist one time. And the kid got mad about something, and the kid tore down the mini blinds from the window and gathered them up together like a baseball bat, and he whacked the therapist across the head with it, and she got a concussion from it. I mean, she had a big, knot, like the size of an egg on her forehead. So that's like previously what happened before the kid came in with a knife threatening to kill her.
Oh, wow.
So.
That's premeditated.
I'm sorry, but they'd already been called. My door would have been locked, and I'd been calling the police.
Well, it's important to remember that you're not in the the safest of industries all the time.
I would put my chair by the door.
Yeah?
Well, I mean, it's important about working for a place that's going to back you up and
Yes.
what, looking out for you too.
Well, whenever I was working administration one day, I had to help you out with a
Yes.
client one day and had to ask him to leave. It got
And
pretty.
she wasn't going to, was
She
she?
was not going to.
You
I had
you
to
did.
insist that she leave, but
Yeah.
so yeah, it can get kind of scary. It can get
Mhm.
kind of heated, but I really appreciate you guys sharing the stories because again, it's important for us to all realize that what's at stake.
This is a dangerous.
Can be. Absolutely
I've
can
been
be.
threatened before, not here, but I've been threatened before
Yeah.
with somebody coming in and gonna bring a gun. I'm coming in, I wanna know where my child is and,
That
my
happened to
thing
me at a different agency with a DHS report.
My statement to them was because they kept calling me. And the ex-wife had given them my number.
Perfect.
And I'm telling them, I'm like, I'm sorry, I cannot deny or acknowledge that I know this client or this person you're talking about. Well, I know they're there and you better tell me, I wanna talk to them. I said, well, if you've got their number, then you can call them, because I don't know who you're talking about. Well, I'm coming there and I've got a gun and I'm gonna show you, you're gonna show me where they are. And I'm like, I'm
What do you
sorry, don't call
recommend they
back.
do in situations like that?
I'll call the police.
I did.
Okay. I wanted to make sure.
We locked the doors and.
I
you
figured
know.
that was probably
I
a
don't
pretty
have a
standard
problem with
policy.
it, and
Yeah.
the admin knows if if there's a situation, I just tell them to call the police.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, I had a situation with a child with whose parents were going through divorce where, there is a protective order against the dad. And in court, dad's attorney argued that they wanted to know when, anytime the kid had a medical appointment, the dad needed to be notified of it.
Yeah.
Well, the mom would let the dad know after the fact, when the kid had counseling or whatever. That wasn't good enough for them. So they got a judge to say that he had to be notified prior. Well, then when that happened, then the dad shows up here when the kid's here, and there's a protective order, and we had called the police in that situation. So.
That's the hard thing, is making that decision is, do I call or do I not? I call. I'll deal with,
The fallout afterwards,
yeah.
Thankfully, these aren't daily occurrences.
And probably a good segue into talking about boundaries. So we can talk about some of the ways to prevent some of those things, right? So, what are some good examples? I know all of you, this is probably 101. You guys probably do this and set it up right away. What are some personal boundaries that you set up right away with clients? That you just have found that just makes your practice easier?
When they can communicate with you.
Okay. That's good.
I share with clients, and Piper and I have a client we've had about 5 years, and I've shared with her that it's best, one of my boundaries is it's best for me during sessions that if you get like angry and start cussing, like blaming me, and you start cussing or getting really loud, like I want it to be a safe place in her to be able to feel free to be like expressive, but sometimes this client,
It has to be appropriate.
yes, and so I've had to say, when you start yelling or cussing, using the F word and blaming, like, we need to revisit this, maybe like take 5 minutes and go calm down and then come back and we'll talk.
But you've got a clear boundary. If you cross that, then we've got steps we're gonna do. Okay. Anybody else? Anything unique or anything you've set up as a blanket?
Actually, a boundary of respect, what
Okay.
respect looks like.
Very good. Yeah, so you define respect and then you set that boundary early on.
And
That's
they
great.
have to define it, because my definition may not be their
I
definition.
love that.
Exactly.
Very good. Very good. Very cool. Yeah.
I was gonna say, I know Yvonne has some with no-shows.
Yes, I do, and I've actually printed it out, and other therapists have bought it. It's missed or canceled appointments can really tick me off. because that time could go to someone else.
Mhm.
So
Absolutely.
I think
Right.
it's, if they miss like 3 appointments within like 6 months, then, they're on a waiting list, and it'll be it'll be like 90 days before they can restart the services, and it's $100 restart fee for, insurance clients. If it's a Medicaid client, then if they miss appointments, then, they will have to wait 30 days depending on their diagnosis. Yeah, so there's
Has that
some other
solved a lot of
stuff too.
problems for you?
Yeah.
Yeah, good,
Mhm.
awesome.
I think also just with the number of people seeking services now, as long as you have these conversations up front with them, it's helped cut down. Because I've told people, like, if you're gonna be missing, then there are a lot of people that want help right now, like, we're gonna offer that time slot to someone else. And then I'll tell them, with mine, it's like if they miss 3 appointments. And I said, I'll refer you to another clinician in the agency, but they're gonna know why
It's the same
you're
thing,
being
yeah.
referred. And I said, it's gonna be a lot more difficult for you to find a clinician that's gonna want to try to work with you if you're not showing up for your appointments.
I also do, I've just started this, 6 sessions, because just having so many clients that want trauma work, I wanna make sure that they want to work on trauma. Another therapist a friend, she says, some clients just wanna come and they're like rent a friend.
True.
I don't want
That's
any
true.
rent a friends.
Yeah.
I've got 2 or 3 that
Yeah.
I'm not doing that.
Yeah, I
No.
used to fire those as a personal trainer all the time. When we got too close,
Yeah.
you
I'm
start,
not your friend.
yeah, no.
Well,
Yeah.
or your family, no.
No.
No, I'm not.
I had one where,
Uh-uh.
we had our scheduled appointments on a certain day and time each week, and then she'd always want to flake out, cancel, I don't have anything to talk about.
Yeah.
But then it's like Sunday morning, she's calling or texting, and, I'm in a fight with my mom, and it's like, I'm not like on call. Like,
Yeah.
That's not what therapy is. I said, okay, at our scheduled appointment next week, we can talk about what led up to the fight. How did you handle it? How could you respond differently? But it's not, I'm not on speed dial. That's, where you don't set appointments and then you just call when you want something right in the moment. That's not how I operate. I'm not a crisis.
What if she killed her mom, and it was like she had reached out to you? Because I had that to happen, not the killing, but
Right.
I had a call with one of my clients from here at 3 a.m,
Mm-hmm.
and it was like, okay, what's the problem? EMSA was there, the police, and getting ready to take them to the emergency room. What was I to do?
So what I tell my clients up front is I tell them my business hours, Monday through Friday, are 8:30 till 5:30. And so I say, if you call or text outside of those hours, if it's a text, I'll read it, I might acknowledge that I read it, a thumbs up or whatever, and then we'll discuss it in your next session. But I tell them, if it is an emergency, you need to let me know it is an emergency. You have to let me know what the emergency is too. Because some people think everything's an emergency, and it's not. And so I tell them, once you've done that, if I agree with your assessment that it is an emergency, I will get back with you as soon as I can. If you can't get a hold of me, a lot of times I'll turn my ringer off that night. If someone tried to call or text me, might not be getting it. If you can't get a hold of me, that's when you need to call Copes in Tulsa County or the police, or reach out, go to the emergency room, something like that. But I tell them, if you say it's an emergency, you say what the emergency is, I read the message, hear the message, and I agree with you, it's an emergency, I will get back with you as soon as I can. Otherwise, I'm waiting until the next business day to return your call.
I do something similar, but I say I'm like a doctor's office. So if you are having a heart attack, you're not gonna call your doctor's office.
Right.
You're gonna call the ambulance. I am your doctor's office.
Mhm.
So Copes is your ambulance.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah, and that's a boundary thing, right? We just all talked about a good boundary, so.
I'll give one other example real quick. You're talking about setting boundaries with clients about being respectful and stuff. One time a client had come in up front, was irate about something, going off, being disrespectful to whichever admin staff was up front or whatever. I think I just happened to be up there and overheard it or whatever, so I went up there and I go, can I talk to you? Maybe he asked to talk to me or something, who's in charge, blah, blah, blah. I don't remember if they called me up or if I was just walking by or whatever, but I'm like, come back here to this room and talk with me. And we go in one of the offices and he's all upset and being loud and disrespectful and stuff. And I help, speak soft, speak slow. And I just told him, I said, we want to help you. We can help you, but you have to act appropriately. And that's not treating the staff like that. That's not being disrespectful. I said, those are my expectations. I said, we're here to help you if you want the help, if you're going to be respectful about it. But I said, we don't need you here. If you're not going to be respectful, then you can leave and you can go somewhere else. So he calmed down, and then he actually asked if I could be his therapist. And so I ended up being his therapist in that situation. But
That was a good de-escalation too.
Very, very good. Well, and it also shows when we set boundaries, it's a win-win for both.
Right.
That we don't have to accept unacceptable behaviors. And a lot of our families, I want to be careful, I don't want to be judgmental, a lot of just families, come from families that there are unacceptable behaviors. And they weren't taught how to
Right.
even recognize them.
Yeah, they don't know what boundaries are.
Right, they just thought this was the norm. I see it in AA and Al-Anon, and it's a huge thing, and not knowing like, oh, it's unacceptable to raise my voice, oh, people just talk, we're like, yeah, like, we can just talk, we don't have to raise our voices.
I've had situations like that where someone's mad, it's a phone call or in person, not even necessarily with the client, even professionally, where, someone goes off on me, they're swearing at me and stuff, and I'll just tell them, I'm sorry, I don't allow people to talk to me like that. Like, if you're gonna continue to speak that way to me, the conversation's over, I'm gonna hang up. Once you've calmed down and can speak appropriately, you can call me back, but I don't allow people to talk to me that way. So.
I have a potty mouth, and so normally I don't even notice when someone's talking. I don't even notice. I really but that's difference in what I do and how I approach, because I tell people I am not a therapist. I don't want to hear your problems. I have one focus, like what's the outcome you want, what's the goal. We follow my little pattern, my little system, and then either I can help you or I can't. That's it. But I'm not sitting here and listening to somebody talk about their problems for an hour. That's not what I do. I didn't go to school for that. And so immediately whenever I start getting berated or anything like that, I just try to refocus on, hey, what did you hire me for? Like, why are we here?
Yeah.
Like, is this what you wanted? Because honestly, yeah, I can buy you a pillow and you can just yell at that thing. So anyway, but that's a boundary that I establish kind of early on, is just that I'm not here to listen to your problems. I'm here to get you on the other side of your problem. So that's what I do. Question to ask yourself: whose needs are being met in this relationship? The client's or my own? That's just a good way to set boundaries, because a lot of times we will violate boundaries thinking that we're helping the client, and when we're not. So setting those boundaries is there to meet the needs of the client.
And realize your own limitations. Realize if you don't have the expertise, or what you're doing isn't working, or whatever, it's not your goal, it's not your job to save everyone. We aren't the savior.
Very correct.
Our job is to help people. Like I said earlier, help them identify blind spots.
All right, here's a really good distinction to make, is boundary crossings versus boundary violations. I'm sure just based upon the names that you can determine which one is which, but a boundary crossing is a decision to deviate from an established boundary for a specific purpose. A brief excursion with a return to the established limits of a professional relationship, from the Pertinelli-Taylor study in 2003. A boundary crossing is also any activity that moves the clinician from a strictly objective position. Guthrie and Gabbard, 93. Boundary crossings may be minor and may even be therapeutic. A boundary crossing becomes a violation when it becomes harmful to the patient. It can be difficult to assess when harm is caused. So that's one of the reasons why boundaries are there and why boundary crossing is something that you should really be careful about doing, because you may not know that crossing that boundary may have hurt the fidelity. You might have hurt the trust there, because one of the things that client respected about you were the boundaries, and they may not have them anywhere else. And so in an effort to try to help that person, crossing a boundary, and not necessarily a violation, but crossing it, can be harmful or it can be therapeutic. So you have to kind of use best judgment, best practices on, and you know, check with colleagues. That's the other thing too. I always say, you know, when in doubt, just ask a friend. But as Kneale said, most of the time if you're asking the question, most of the time people already kind of know the answer. So, but still good to double check.
When I was reviewing the presentation to get prepared for today, I come up with a good example that I can't think of of what a boundary crossing is, because you know, when I first was looking at it, like I was like, I wonder if people are going to question like what's really the difference.
Didn't you attend someone's graduation or something one time that was kind of something that you normally you wouldn't have done? I can't remember if that was something that we had talked about.
I think I did. I think I attended like a kindergarten graduation.
Yeah, some real unique.
Yeah.
And yeah, but I think you let them know beforehand, like.
Oh, I definitely discuss it with
I won't be.
them, like.
You can't introduce me.
Oh, yeah.
It's like
Because they're a
you know,
therapist,
if you come up and say hi to me afterwards, and there's someone there, and they're like, "Oh, who's this? How do you know this person?"
Yeah.
They need to be prepared. Like, how are they going to answer that question? But some people don't care. You know, like a lot of kids are like proud they
This is my therapist.
Yeah. Or whatever.
Yeah, they haven't been trained by society yet to be ashamed of things they shouldn't be.
I just noticed the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna have to.
We're gonna have to fly through. So, if you need to excuse yourself to use the restroom, go ahead and do it, because we only have like 25 minutes left
And we
for
have a
these
lot
3
of
hours. So I don't want to take another break, and
Yeah,
we are
I
going to go
agree.
through these slides a little faster because we've told a lot of stories.
Boundary violations, avoidable dual or multiple relationships. We had a good example of a dual relationship that was checked with, and really good example on how to handle that ethically. Really appreciate that. Very clear sexual relationships are always a violation, period. That's the number one reason why people lose their businesses and lose their practices, and you wouldn't think you'd have to cover it. But it's the number one thing really you should cover in ethics, because it's the number one problem.
Yeah.
So I think I just remembered the example.
As we're flying through them.
The boundary crossing is, what if you treated another therapist and then you did go to a training and they were there? You know, it's not that therapist can't treat therapist. It's not a violation. It could potentially be a boundary crossing because of being in the same field and possibly the similar location and
Would that be
meeting.
considered dual or multiple relationships? Or would it, because you're both professionals? Dual?
I mean, if you didn't know each other outside of that, but you have the potential of running into them at like future trainings and stuff.
Gotcha.
So it's just,
Okay.
you know, so that's something just to be aware of, that, you know, it could be a potential boundary. It's not as clear cut as just treating a client that you wouldn't be running into at the same type of trainings or things like that.
One thing to remember, it's important consideration of what causes harm to the patient. It's not your intent or even necessarily your behavior, but the meaning of the behavior to the patient. So sometimes a patient may misconstrue a behavior. It's important to get that resolved immediately, okay? Because if they perceive harm, that's still our responsibility.
Who's read the book The Road Less Traveled? Anyone?
I know the song.
It's,
The poem and the song, I know, but
it was written by
I didn't know it
M.
was a
Scott
book.
Peck, who's a psychiatrist. Does anyone remember what he said about sexual relationships with? Do you remember?
It's been a long time since I read it.
So what when I read the book, what struck me was he said that He would have a sexual relationship with a patient if he thought it would be beneficial to the patient. That's how he started it out. But then he qualified that and said, there's no situation that I can think of that it would be beneficial to.
Oh, okay.
So the caveat
Okay.
is, oh yeah, you can't do
Wow.
that.
Yeah.
Exactly, you cannot do that. Let us stress
At all.
that. It is unethical. So,
Period.
It's like finding a married
here's how the
bachelor.
ethics have changed just since I've been moved back to Oklahoma after grad school since 2003. How long did therapy have to be ended before you could have a relationship with a client?
Before or
It used to be
now?
5.
Now it's never.
It used to be 2.
2.
2 now, it's 2. Yeah, but
So-
it used to be
Then it
5.
moved up to 5.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
used to be 2.
What is it now?
Never.
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 I'm going there.
Oh, okay, I didn't even know that.
Yeah, it used to be
No.
2.
Yeah, it changed to never.
Yeah, you couldn't be friends with them, you couldn't have dinner
Well,
with them, you couldn't go to a show, you couldn't do anything with them, you couldn't go to their house, help them with the bartering, help them
Yeah.
paint their house or do any of these things because that was,
So when I
Too
first
close.
started out, the first job that I had after I moved to Oklahoma, so I'm a licensure candidate, and I'm switching from that job to another job, so I'm letting a different company, so I'm letting my clients know, you know, our time together is coming to an end, we're wrapping up, you know, you'll be referred to another therapist to continue therapy or whatever. I had a client that knew our ethical things at that time. In our last session, at the end of the session, she hands me a piece of paper with her name and phone number on it and says, I know you can't have any contact with me for 2 years, hang on to this, and when 2 years.
Oh, God.
wow. Nope.
Trash. Throw it in the
Oh,
trash.
my.
They're actually probably shredded because it had client name and identifying information.
All right, so this is kind of just a moment we're going to take for discussion. We don't have a whole lot of time, but given telehealth and all of that, Zoom, WhatsApp, all the different ways that you can now communicate virtually, what are some concerns? What are you guys like? What are you seeing out there? What are you noticing? What are some things we should be concerned about with telehealth?
The one thing, I will not do it, I won't do Zoom, I don't care if it's virtual, I will not do it because it is not confidential. There's no way you can have it that way because they're sitting there, if they wanna say something to you, if there's someone in the home that has threatened them, they don't even know they've come back. They're sitting there talking to you and they're seeing you and they're no, even with kids, I won't do it because they're walking around the house with the phone or sitting there carrying a, you know, laptop, whatever around.
That's a good point. So
And
these
I've
are all
seen
good.
that.
These are all good concerns.
There's no confidentiality for, you know.
But during the pandemic,
But
It's
you have to
definitely-
make sure that that's not going on. Let them know up front in the beginning.
You can't.
That
How
you
you
can't
do
talk
need to have
to,
that
you
conversation.
can't do counseling if there's other people around.
That there's no proof.
I like to get.
Well,
to know
you'll
my
figure it
clients in
out.
person
I mean,
first,
you'll
so that
know.
when I'm seeing them,
You'll see
and
it,
they're
you'll
starting to
hear
go,
it,
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, can you talk right now? Nope. Awesome.
yeah.
Right.
And they usually
I've
have
tried that,
headphones
but
in,
I've heard
you
a
know.
parent in the background
Right.
that's not supposed to be in their bedroom, that's outside the door.
listening in.
Well, I don't have children though.
Yeah.
So,
I
yeah,
mean,
you
to-
definitely
for
have to have
therapy.
that conversation before
Yeah.
and explain to them that
I do.
confidentiality
Mhm.
may not be as strong as if you're coming into the office.
Mhm.
And
Yes,
that's why I let them know why I don't. They say, well, do you do? I said, no. Why? And I explained the whole situation to them.
right, and it's a therapist preference. Some do, some don't.
Yeah.
We have a therapist that has has pre-existing health conditions, and once COVID came and set it for teletherapy, and we're able to do that, she switched to teletherapy. That's all she does.
Yeah.
Unless she can't do it anymore, I don't think she'll be back in the office.
And that's, like you said, it's either a physical, it can be your own feelings or whatnot, but mine is strictly confidentiality, whether it's a child or it's adult. And that's too dangerous as far as I'm concerned with domestic violence or with child abuse,
That I
because
won't
that's
do
my
if I know
number.
that there's a domestic
Yeah.
violence.
Child
So
abuse,
there's
the kids.
definitely more risk.
Mm-hmm.
So what is required for teleservices if the HIPAA rules are in effect. What, a BAA, who knows what a BAA is? What is it?
I have to send you one like every 6
Right.
months.
Yeah.
If you're doing teleservices with us, we have to have one on file
Right.
for you.
So what is it?
I don't know. what
Some
it
sort of
stands for.
agreement.
It's
Yeah.
an agreement, like with doxing me
Business
or whatever,
assistant
Zoom,
agreement.
whatever,
Yeah.
yeah.
That means that the platform you're using is encrypted. Now, there are platforms like Zoom, your free version of Zoom, free version of Google Meet, that's not
They're not.
encrypted, it doesn't meet that level of encryption. That's why they have the other one, you know, they have the paid version of Google Meet. Which if anyone doesn't know, it's changed. In the past, it was, it worked out, you had to pay for a year in advance, and it was $120 for the one with all the features, so it worked out to $10 a month. Google has changed it, and it can be set up so that you're paying $12 a month, and you can do it month by month. You don't have to pay for a whole year in advance.
DoxyD still has a free version.
Yeah, yeah.
When COVID first started, I knew about Doxy. That was even before I knew about Google Meet.
Yeah.
What I was hearing in the therapy groups I belong to and stuff, first of all, everyone in the country is flooding the teleplatforms.
Yeah.
And people were having problems with DoxyMe, dropping calls in the middle of sessions and stuff. And so people were like, well, maybe it's because I'm using the free version. And Doxy's is, what, $30, $35 a month? So I think Google Meet is the least expensive paid one. That's good, you know, that has good, pretty good quality and stuff. And so people were switching over to the paid version thinking it was going to be better, and they were still having problems and stuff.
So sorry.
And then I just started reading in these groups and stuff. That's how I found out about Google Meet. A number of clinicians were like, we've been using Google Meet for years, we don't have problems with them, and even with people, so many people joining teleplatforms now and stuff, and we're still not having, you know, we're not having additional problems with them because of that and stuff. And you know, it was the least expensive one that I knew about, and so that's, and you have to have like a Google platform to be able to do that, because the company email addresses are through Google. We have that ability, so that's why. That's what we recommend, that's what we offer.
Well, one of the reasons why I was really interested in hearing the feedback from what you guys have been experiencing with telehealth and different things like that. I was interested what you said about, you know, you like to kind of meet people in person. I'm wondering if you all have experienced a lack of like initial emotional intelligence, rapport, bonding, like intimacy, you know, like that trust, being able to develop that as quickly over telehealth. Have you guys been experiencing that, or is it about the same?
At first I didn't like it. I was like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, this is
Yeah.
so weird. But
Yeah.
I have clients that are strictly virtual. I've never met them in person.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's been wonderful. I mean,
Good.
sometimes even better.
I know, some people prefer
Yeah,
it.
because then they're just like, blah.
I've wondered about that, because being in the privacy of your own home, you'd be more
Right.
likely to say whatever you want. you
Right.
know, so
I think
maybe-
it's particularly helpful for specific clients too, especially like clients with agoraphobia.
Yeah.
You know, that have been diagnosed with that, and you know, certain anxiety,
Transportation
trying to get-
issues.
right, transportation issues, especially someone in rural Oklahoma that doesn't have easy access to a clinician, you know, now to do that. I don't prefer it. I still prefer to meet with people in person. I only have one client that I do telesessions with, and it's a similar type of thing. I have not met the person in person, you know, so.
Well, I really appreciate all the feedback, guys. Thanks. We better move on. Dual relationships. All right. So in therapy, a dual relationship occurs when a professional has a second significantly different relationship with his or her client in addition to the traditional client-therapist one. This may be a professional relationship, such as playing the part of both counselor and teacher, or it may be of a non-professional nature, as in the case of a therapist who is also a friend or intimate partner of the person seeking therapy. Due to the complications that may arise in sexual and non-sexual situations, the existence of a dual relationship presents ethical considerations and potentially legal issues. However, a dual relationship is not necessarily unethical. It may pave the way for a strengthened relationship, bond, or a beneficial exchange of goods and services. Anybody have any questions on dual relationships or have any, I mean, we've had some good examples of some that are ethical and good and can be beneficial, and we've had some examples of really not okay ones. Are there any that y'all want to talk about that we haven't covered?
Yeah, as a school counselor,
Mm-hmm.
I cannot be a therapist to the kids in the building, even though I get the request regularly every week, because we're without an embedded one. So.
So what's the workaround? How do you handle it?
How do I work around it?
Mhm.
I usually send in a referral to improving lives. I send it in
Yeah.
and try to get them from there.
Yeah.
But I get the request. I even get it during the intake.
Right.
I'm in a alternative school,
Gotcha.
and
Gotcha.
that happens.
Right, because then you would have a dual role. You would have your therapy role and then the school
School
role,
counselor.
right? So,
Can't work. Yeah. that-
like
good
I
point.
said, the reasons we're dual relationships in the past that have been like acceptable and stuff are going away because of teleservices. You know, it's these situations where, you know, someone is in a rural area and there's only one provider out there and stuff. You know, now they can meet with someone across state. Now, I mean, I guess you could still argue maybe they want to meet with someone in person, you know, and there's still only one clinician within a so many mile radius or whatever, so.
How do you handle it if you have like a book club or a church group or something like that, and somebody shows up that has been a client in the past or something like that? How'd you handle that?
Well, since I've actually been in that situation. So what I did was I distanced myself from the group when I took them on as a client.
Gotcha.
So that was the thing that seemed to make the most amount of sense.
Okay.
You know, I disassociate with the group while I was.
So that was a situation where you were in a situation that someone was in and then they wanted to
Yes.
seek you. What if it's the opposite?
Yeah.
Okay, so.
That you're seeing someone as a client and you're in a book club and then all of a sudden, maybe they're not still a client, but then they join the book club, but they had been a client of yours in the past.
Gotcha. Well, of course, I wouldn't initiate the relationship with them based on the idea, and I know that, so I would speak from my point of view, but if it seemed like it was drawing uncomfortable, or if they draw attention, well, Mr. Terry is great because he counsels and he does this. Then that's the point when I gotta say, okay, I probably need to stop showing up.
Yeah.
So I think you mentioned a book club or a church. I see that as a little different too, because a book club's probably more intimate, more a smaller group and stuff, versus if you go to a big church and then you see someone
yeah.
at that church that, you know, used to be a client of yours in the past. I wouldn't say you have to quit going to church there.
No,
You know?
it was a men's group afterwards, so
Right.
it was
Gotcha.
much
Right.
smaller in nature than it was if it was
Right.
2,000 congregations.
Right. So that's why I'm saying it depends on the circumstances, you know.
So here's some types of dual relationships according to the Zur Institute, and we have these source sheets. So, social dual relationship, that's the professional is also a friend. Professional dual relationship, the professional doubles as someone's work colleague or collaborator. Business dual relationship, the professional is also involved with someone in a business capacity. Communal dual relationship, both professional and client are members of a small community and will likely run into each other or be involved in the same activities outside of the office. One of the examples we were talking about. Institutional dual relationship, the professional serves as a counselor and other roles within a particular institution such as a prison, hospital, or in the military.
So that's like what you were talking about. If you would become the therapist of someone at the school when you also have a school role.
Yeah. Forensic dual relationship, the professional is a counselor as well as a witness in legal trials or hearings involving his or her client. Supervisory dual relationship, the professional is also responsible for overseeing and supervising the client's development as a professional therapist or counselor, as often occurs in educational settings. That happens a lot with in hypnosis, you practice on one another. So like two people in the same workshop to learn hypnosis, you're gonna go back and forth and do hypnosis on one another, and that's kind of like an educational setting where you're working in, you're both in the same field, you're both trying to do this to help others, but you're actually working together with each other to learn the modality.
So
Right?
that happens a lot, like, when people are learning different techniques and stuff. So like, when you're learning brain spotting, right, before you get to the point where you're actually working with clients and stuff, you work with like another clinician and you practice the techniques with that person.
That would be considered totally ethical dual relationship. So, Digital, online, or internet dual relationship. The professional is connected with the client on social media sites such as Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Do you guys have any situations where you have ever found that acceptable? To be connected to a client on social media? Okay. And this is a question that we are talking about, so.
I have some clients that they constantly lose their phone, or they just don't pay their bill because of finances, and so it's definitely not a friendship thing. It's just like, that's just how I could reach them, and so, but that's as far as it goes, like.
That was the only
Yeah.
line of
Just-
real communication
right.
that you knew you could get. I think Kneale had a similar.
I think that's the
circumstance.
reason why the
Like if
ethical
you,
boards and stuff haven't adopted a hard and fast rule. I do think it's discouraged. I do think there are exceptions where it can be helpful. I personally had a situation where I have a client that's homeless. And it's the
That's
same
it,
type of
yes.
thing. They
Yeah.
don't, they have a phone, but like you said, their phone bill's not being paid or whatever. You can't contact them by text or phone. They don't have a certain location, like where you say, we're meeting on this day and time, like, because they don't have a home that you meet them at on Thursdays at 4 or whatever. And so, that's the similar situation with me. That's how I find out where the client is, schedule where we're gonna meet, at what time, through Messenger, and then that's it,
right,
you know?
because they'll go, a lot of times they'll go like to where there is Wi-Fi, so they can pick up the
Right.
Wi-Fi. And just yesterday, I literally asked a client that is homeless, where are you staying now? Where are we meeting? And so it was, but again, if you would pull those records, you would see that that was all, that's where it cuts off.
Yeah.
So-
And that's why, I mean, that's how I treat social media and the whole, in general anyway, because I know social media is not secure, and so I'm not gonna put stuff on social media that I don't want people to know anyway, you know?
I don't even call the person by the name.
Mhm.
Like I don't even put the person's name in the comments, so.
Good things to think about. Finally, sexual dual relationship, any situation where that's okay? No?
No.
We're all agreed on that. Kneale, do you have a policy on that?
Yeah, follow the state laws. So I did an ethics training in the past, and the presenter, this was before it was a lifetime banishment of contacting previous clients. And the example that they used, it was a male therapist who had fallen in love with a female client. And what that therapist did, they wanted to pursue a relationship with this person. What that therapist did was they bailed their license into the state. It was no longer a therapist.
Oh my gosh.
They, I guess for them, thought it was worth it to give up their career as a therapist in order to
That's
pursue.
love.
But
You better be convinced, huh?
as you're gonna see in one of these
Jeez.
next slides, the reason that that's an issue is because there is a power differential between a clinician and a
Wow,
client.
that's true.
And that's why it's still unethical, even no matter
And
what.
all the things you know about that client.
Yeah, it's right. Yeah, too much inside information, too
Right,
much
and
ability
how
to be able to
Have a
manipulate
relationship.
emotions
Yep.
and yeah, there's power
Everything.
dynamic.
Well, and why do you think a lot of times clients fall in love with their therapist?
Mhm.
Because here's someone that's giving them their undivided attention for an hour a week and is listening to them and stuff.
Yeah,
But that's your like paid role. at
Yeah.
that
Right.
point, you know,
it's
like,
not,
It's
yeah.
the same with the doctor.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether, especially, and I've heard this from some of them, that they have actually fallen in love with their obstetrician.
Mm.
Oh my.
And because they're the ones that
That would be
all
awkward.
the attention they're getting with the baby and the touch and the comfort and then it's like, I'm like, okay, what does your husband think?
We do
I
have to
don't
rock
care
and
what
roll.
he thinks.
We
Yeah,
gotta
we
roll,
g-
Kneale.
yeah,
I'm
we're
sorry,
gonna-
guys.
it's
almost
All right, we have to
Yeah.
cover the law.
This
So,
one's important, so we're gonna read this
LPC
one.
Act of Oklahoma.
Right there.
Concerning dual relationships. LPCs shall not knowingly enter into a dual relationship and shall take any necessary precautions to prevent a dual relationship from occurring. When the LPC reasonably suspects that he or she has inadvertently entered into a dual relationship, the LPC shall record that fact in the records of the affected clients and take responsible or reasonable steps to eliminate the source or agent creating or causing the dual relationship. If the dual relationship cannot be prevented or eliminated and the LPC cannot readily refer the client to another counselor,
Oh, jeez, I thought
to
that
another
was,
counselor or other, that's
Stability.
my alarm to wake up, so you just scared me. If you can't refer the client to another counselor or other professional, the LPC shall complete one or more of the following measures as necessary to prevent the exploitation of the client and or the impairment of the LPC's professional judgment. 1, fully disclose the circumstances of the dual relationship to the client and secure the client's written consent to continue providing counseling. And then 2, consult with the other professionals to understand the potential impairment to the LPC's professional judgment and the risk of harm to the client of continuing the dual relationship. Everybody good? That's the law, it's a mouthful. All right, ethical concerns with dual relationships. The most controversial of dual relationships are in regard to sexual nature between client and clinician. These may even present legal issues in the long run. I assure you they absolutely will. On the surface, sexual dual relationships may appear to occur between 2 consenting adults. However, due to the nature of therapy, which involves the client sharing intimate thoughts and exploring raw emotional territory with the professional, and therefore being in an especially vulnerable position, the client often ends up feeling victimized. This feeling may exacerbate his or her mental health concerns by increasing depressive symptoms or suicidal ideation. Lawsuits, criminal complaints, and licensing board issues will likely ensue. Boundary setting in non-sexual dual relationships. To be fully prepared to address the needs of a client in a non-sexual dual relationship situation, it's essential to educate oneself on the potential complexities and consequences that may arise. Take time to assess how the multiple relationships may affect the client's ability to delve deep and face difficult situations or issues. Will boundaries be crossed? Is the relationship truly beneficial for both professional and client? In some cases, dual nature of relationships can be beneficial from a clinical experiential standpoint. For example, if the therapist and client are colleagues in the mental health field and interested in exploring certain techniques together, this may prove useful so long as guidelines and boundaries are established and agreed upon ahead of time.
Okay,
And we're at 2.
we're like an hour behind. So I'm just gonna preface this real quick. This last section is about bartering.
oh,
The major thing you need to know about bartering is they're bartering for goods and bartering for services. I don't think you can barter for services in Oklahoma. Bartering for goods is something that the client has to bring up at the beginning of the therapy thing. Some people do it kind of like from a pro bono basis where the client, maybe they're homeless, maybe it's a cultural thing or something, but you know, like here, you know, it's a rural area or something, you know, maybe they live on a little farm, they have chickens or whatever,
Chickens and
and they want to
eggs.
bring you a dozen eggs each time for, you know.
yeah.
If, I've never came into a situation where I've been approached by any client wanting to do bartering. If you do, make sure you look over the rules and regulations before you do, because it's very specific what you can and cannot do.
And it has to be discussed during the informed consent portion. If it's not, it's never okay.
So that's what this next section is.
Yeah.
So I am just gonna fly through these
And you will
slides.
get these, okay? So go over these.
Part of the reasons why you can't do bartering for services, like let's say your client's a mechanic and there's something wrong with your car, and you're like, oh, you can pay me, you can fix my car for, to pay for the session or whatever. What if they mess your car worse?
Yeah.
You know, that's gonna affect the nature of your relationship. So that's why.
And it's very hard to determine worth on how much their labor and is worth versus your
Therapy.
services and therapy. And so you have to really be strict on outlining exactly how much you're bartering if you're gonna do services, which again, I don't think you can do them in Oklahoma.
So that's what this whole section was. And just.
In summary, even though it is infrequent, therapists obviously get involved with bartering over their years of conducting therapy. Each case presents a challenge. Each arrangement demands the therapist to consider the client's need, condition, wishes, personality, culture, etc. The professional also always has to look within his or herself to make sure that they are aware of their needs and desires and do not confuse them with what can be beneficial to their clients. Ethical therapists use consultants and consultations regularly and rely heavily on expert colleagues' opinions.
before you go bye-bye? What about gifts? That's a, very quickly.
Gifts of a small, like,
Under $20.
not worth very much, you know, like, the client can give them to you.
Handmade, something like that.
So,
You don't wanna offend your
You don't-
client
right,
by, like,
yeah.
returning something too,
Yeah.
like, that-
Well, I mean,
You
in
have
the
to be careful, but you don't
LPC
want
thing,
to,
I mean, it says gifts are not, you
Accept.
cannot accept a gift, a card,
I wouldn't.
yeah, a
But-
card or something.
I would accept
but
a card.
Yeah, I'd accept
Yeah.
a card.
Or if a
But
kid draws you a picture
a
or
gift,
something.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, they go out and buy, yeah, because here's this thing, it's like, well, I mean, if they give you, here's some donuts.
Ah.
Okay, well, that's, we're sharing this, okay, you know,
Well,
but-
well, if they make Christmas candy, and, you know,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
just send
that's-
them
Yeah,
a-
that's
right,
okay.
like,
Yeah.
You know, here, I'll
Right.
give you some
but a
Christmas
gift,
candy.
that they go out and buy, oh, I bought you this, you know, TV.
No.
no, no, no,
I
no,
bought
no.
you this, oh, look,
Right.
I found this
A bowl.
ring.
No.
Yeah, yeah.
It's, and
Yeah.
that's and it's just a gift because I wanna show you my appreciation, and it's like, I'm sorry, legally, I cannot accept
Right.
gifts.
If
And
they give
that's
you a
just
card
my-
with
I've
a
never had a
winning
client
lottery
offer to
ticket in
give
it,
me
there you go.
Okay, one slide left.
Last slide. All right, if you find yourself or another professional struggling with an ethical dilemma, most mental health care professionals mean well and are willing to take accountability for their own stuff. So it's important to give ourselves, colleagues, and clients the benefit of the doubt. However, if it becomes clear that a violation has occurred or potentially occurred, the professional in question should candidly be informed of the concerns. If there is a serious and clear violation of ethical standards, such as a therapist attempting to have a sexual relationship with a client, there is no exception to that rule. The professional in question is to report or be reported to the State Professional Licensing Board. If in doubt, consult with other professionals. All
Any
right.
questions before we dismiss?
So as a school counselor, I can't go back and be the therapist in my building.
Correct.
Okay. I need to know that because I've been asked. Now,
Thank you for the question.
yeah.
And thank you all for your feedback and
Can
help
you give me
today.
your phone
It's
number?
big
So
help.
I'm
It makes
Tommy,
it
I'm a
way
therapist.
easier whenever we're not
So
just
I
up
can
here
talk to
spouting
you
information.
more about that.
So, want to be respectful of your
I'm going
time.
with
Thank you all
time
so
when a
much for
client
being
keeps
here.
canceling.
If you learn
Thank you,
something,
guys.
I'm
Yeah.
having that
Give them
right
their
now, and I've never had it
certificate,
before.
it will
And
always
it's,
be
and I
up
don't
to you.
Okay.
know how to deal with
Which,
it. I
the
mean, I
board's
don't.
changed how they've done
So
things,
I
like
have
just being approved to present this. I don't get the thing like we got in the paper, like we got in the past to pass out to you. So, and they're getting ready to change how to even do CEUs for next year, starting July
Every
1st.
time you do that?
To even
I mean,
be
when you get a
presenter,
new
you have to
client?
go through the process and get approved
Okay.
by the board, so
When I get a new client,
my goal is to
and even
do that by the end of this month.
and you're having a problem,
If not,
you can
I'll
go
miss
with
the
it.
June board meeting to get
That's
approved
true.
and
If
get
you
it
know of
out.
Okay.
anyone who would
Yeah.
like to purchase this, we will have this available for purchase, this course,
On the website.
on the website, and
And any
everything will
other
be there.
ones we've done in the past, that we recorded. We just hadn't recorded this one in the past because in the past it wasn't allowed to be, you had to be in person,
So will you be doing any more before the end of July? Or June?
In person?
Sorry.
End of June.
Ethics, or just?
Or just in,
Oh, okay, thank
I
you.
don't know.
We
Thank
have
you.
them available, they're ready to go, we just have to get them submitted, right?
Because I need to
We have
Yes.
all of the other, yeah, we have like, I think 9 hours of other courses so far that we've done.
well, that would be good.
Yeah, well, they've already been approved, we did them in person last year and we recorded them, and now because they're allowing us to do virtual, now we can reuse
Excuse me,
them
I'm
now. So that's how we're gonna.
The distinction is if you go through the approval process, if it's officially approved, it'll be put on their website. You can do other courses that aren't approved on the website, it's just, they audit so many people each year.